Introduction to A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. A Note to the Reader. This book is, in all probability, the last of a series of writings of which, disregarding certain earlier disconnected essays, my Anticipations was the beginning. Originally I intended Anticipations to be my sole digression from my art or trade, or what you will, of an imaginative writer. I wrote that book in order to clear up the muddle in my own mind about innumerable social and political questions I could not keep out of my work, which it distressed me to touch upon in a stupid haphazard way, and which no one, so far as I knew, had handled in a manner to satisfy my needs. But Anticipations did not achieve its end. I have a slow, constructive, hesitating sort of mind, and when I emerged from that undertaking I found I had still most of my questions to state and solve. In Mankind in the Making, therefore, I tried to review the social organization in a different way, to consider it as an educational process instead of dealing with it as a thing with future history. And if I made this second book even less satisfactory from a literary standpoint than the former, and this is my opinion, I blundered, I think, more edifyingly, at least from the point of view of my own instruction. I ventured upon several themes with a greater frankness than I had used in Anticipations. I came out of that second effort guilty of much rash writing, but with a considerable development of formed opinion. In many matters I had shaped out at last a certain personal certitude, upon which I feel I shall go for the rest of my days. In this present book I have tried to settle accounts with the number of issues left over or opened up by its two predecessors, to correct them in some particulars, and to give the general picture of a Utopia that has grown up in my mind during the course of these speculations as a state of affairs at once possible and more desirable than the world in which I live. But this book has brought me back to imaginative writing again. In its two predecessors the treatment of social organization had been purely objective. Here my intention has been a little wider and deeper, in that I have tried to present not simply an ideal, but an ideal in reaction with two personalities. Moreover, since this may be the last book of the kind I shall ever publish, I have written into it as well as I can the heretical, metaphysical scepticism upon which all my thinking rests, and I have inserted certain sections reflecting upon the established methods of sociological and economic science. The last four words will not attract the butterfly reader, I know. I have done my best to make the whole of this book as lucid and entertaining as its matter permits, because I want it read by as many people as possible, but I do not promise anything but rage and confusion to him who proposes to glance through my pages just to see if I agree with him, or to begin in the middle, or to read without a constantly alert attention. If you are not already a little interested and open-minded with regard to social and political questions, and a little exercised in self-examination, you will find neither interest nor pleasure here. If your mind is made up upon such issues, your time will be wasted on these pages. And even if you are a willing reader, you may require a little patience for the peculiar method I have this time adopted. That method assumes an air of haphazard, but it is not so careless as it seems. I believe it to be, even now that I am through with the book, the best way to a sort of lucid vagueness which has always been my intention in this matter. I tried over several beginnings of a Utopian book before I adopted this. I rejected from the outset the form of an argumentative essay, the form which appeals most readily to what is called the serious reader, the reader who is often no more than the solemnly impatient parasite of great questions. He likes everything in hard, heavy lines, black and white, yes and no, because he does not understand how much there is that cannot be presented at all in that way, wherever there is any effect of obliquity, of incommensurables, wherever there is any levity or humour or difficulty of multiplex presentation, he refuses attention. Mentally he seems to be built up upon an invincible assumption that the spirit of creation cannot count beyond two. He deals only in alternatives. Such readers I have resolved not to attempt to please here, even if I presented all my triclinic crystals as systems of cubes. Indeed, I felt it would not be worth doing. But having rejected the serious essay as a form, I was still greatly exercised. I spent some vacillating months over the scheme of this book. I tried first a recognised method of viewing questions from divergent points that has always attracted me, and which I have never succeeded in using, the discussion novel, after the fashion of Peacock's and Mr. Mallock's development of the ancient dialogue. But this encumbered me with unnecessary characters and the inevitable complications of intrigue among them, and I abandoned it. After that, I tried to cast the thing into a shape resembling a little the double personality of Boswell's Johnson, a sort of interplay between monologue and commentator. But that too, although it got nearer to the quality I sought, finally failed. Then I hesitated over what one might call hard narrative. It will be evident to the experienced reader that by omitting certain speculative and metaphysical elements, and by elaborating incident, this book might have been reduced to a straightforward story. But I did not want to omit as much on this occasion. I did not see why I should always pander to the vulgar appetite for stark stories, and in short I made it this. I explain all this in order to make it clear to the reader that, however queer this book appears at the first examination, it is the outcome of trial and deliberation. It is intended to be as it is. I am aiming throughout at a sort of shot silk texture between philosophical discussion on the one hand, and imaginative narrative on the other. H. G. Wells. A Modern Utopia. The owner of the voice. There are works, and this is one of them, that are best begun with a portrait of the author. And here indeed, because of a very natural misunderstanding, this is the only course to take. Throughout these papers sounds a note, a distinctive and personal note, a note that tends at times towards stridency, and all that is not, as these words are in italics, is in one voice. Now this voice, and this is the peculiarity of the matter, is not to be taken as the voice of the ostensible author who fathers these pages. You have to clear your mind of any preconceptions in that respect. The owner of the voice you must figure to yourself as a whitish plump man, a little under the middle size and age, with such blue eyes as many Irishmen have, and agile in his movements, and with a slight tonsorial baldness, a penny might cover it, of the crown. His front is convex. He droops at times, like most of us, but for the greater part he bears himself as valiantly as a sparrow. Occasionally his hand flies out with a fluttering gesture of illustration, and his voice, which is our medium henceforth, is an unattractive tenor that becomes at times aggressive. Him you must imagine as sitting at a table reading a manuscript about Utopias, a manuscript he holds in two hands that are just a little fat at the wrist. The curtain rises upon him so. But afterwards, if the devices of this declining art of literature prevail, you will go with him through curious and interesting experiences. Yet ever and again you will find him back at that little table, the manuscript in his hand, and the expansion of his ratiocinations about Utopia conscientiously resumed. The entertainment before you is neither the set drama of the work of fiction you are accustomed to read, nor the set lecturing of the essay you are accustomed to evade, but a hybrid of these two. If you figure this owner of the voice as sitting, a little nervously, a little modestly, on a stage, with table, glass of water, and all complete, and myself as the intrinsic chairman, insisting with a bland ruthlessness upon his few words of introduction before he recedes into the wings, and if furthermore you figure a sheet before our friend, on which moving pictures intermittently appear, and if finally you suppose his subject to be the story of the adventure of his soul among utopian inquiries, you will be prepared for some at least of the difficulties of this unworthy but unusual work. But over against this writer here presented, There is also another earthly person in the book, who gathers himself together in a distinct personality only after a preliminary complication with the reader. This person is spoken of as the botanist, and he is a leaner, rather taller, graver, and much less garrulous man. His face is weakly handsome and done in tones of grey. He is fairish and grey-eyed, and you would suspect him of dyspepsia. It is a justifiable suspicion. Men of this type, the chairman remarks with a sudden intrusion of exposition, are romantic with a shadow of meanness. They seek at once to conceal and shape their sensuous cravings beneath egregious sentimentalities. They get into mighty tangles and troubles with women, and he has had his troubles. You will hear of them, for that is the quality of his type. He gets no personal expression in this book. The voice is always that other's. But you gather much of the matter and something of the manner of his interpolations from the asides and the tenor of the voice. So much by way of portraiture is necessary to present the explorers of the modern Utopia, which will unfold itself as a background to these two inquiring figures. The image of a cinematograph entertainment is the one to grasp. There will be an effect of these two people going to and fro in front of the circle of a rather defective lantern, which sometimes jams and sometimes gets out of focus, but which does occasionally succeed in displaying on a screen a momentary moving picture of Utopian conditions. Occasionally the picture goes out altogether. The voice argues, and the footlights return, and then you find yourself listening again to the rather too plump little man at his table, laboriously enunciating propositions, upon whom the curtain rises now. End of introduction. Chapter 1 of A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter the First. Topographical. Section 1. The Utopia of a modern dreamer must needs differ in one fundamental aspect from the nowheres and utopias men planned before Darwin quickened the thought of the world. Those were all perfect and static states, a balance of happiness won for ever against the forces of unrest and disorder that inhere in things. One beheld a healthy and simple generation enjoying the fruits of the earth in an atmosphere of virtue and happiness, to be followed by other virtuous, happy, and entirely similar generations, until the gods grew weary. Change and development were dammed back by invincible dams for ever. But the modern Utopia must be not static but kinetic, must shape, not as a permanent state, but as a hopeful stage, leading to a long ascent of stages. Nowadays we do not resist and overcome the great stream of things, but rather float upon it. We build now not citadels, but ships of state. For one ordered arrangement of citizens rejoicing in an equality of happiness, safe and assured to them and their children for ever, we have to plan a flexible common compromise, in which a perpetually novel succession of individualities may converge most effectually upon a comprehensive onward development. That is the first, most generalized difference between a Utopia based upon modern conceptions and all the Utopias that were written in the former time. Our business here is to be Utopian, to make vivid and creditable, if we can, first this facet and then that of an imaginary whole and happy world. Our deliberate intention is to be not, indeed, impossible, but most distinctly impracticable by every scale that reaches only between today and tomorrow. We are to turn our backs for a space upon the insistent examination of the thing that is, and face towards the freer air,
the ampler spaces of the thing that perhaps might be, to the projection of a state or city worth while, to designing upon the sheet of our imaginations the picture of a life conceivably possible, and yet better worth living than our own. That is our present enterprise. We are going to lay down certain necessary starting propositions, and then we shall proceed to explore the sort of world these propositions give us. It is no doubt an optimistic enterprise, but it is good for a while to be free from the carping note that must needs be audible when we discuss our present imperfections, to release ourselves from practical difficulties and the tangle of ways and means. It is good to stop by the track for a space, put aside the knapsack, wipe the brows, and talk a little of the upper slopes of the mountain we think we are climbing, would but the trees let us see it. There is to be no inquiry here of policy and method. There is to be a holiday from politics and movements and methods. But for all that, we must needs define certain limitations. Were we free to have our untrammelled desire, I suppose we should follow Morris to his nowhere. We should change the nature of man and the nature of things together. We should make the whole race wise, tolerant, noble, perfect. Wave our hands to a splendid anarchy, every man doing as it pleases him, and none pleased to do evil. In a world as good in its essential nature, as ripe and sunny as the world before the fall. But that golden age, that perfect world, comes out into the possibilities of space and time. In space and time, the pervading will to live sustains for evermore a perpetuity of aggressions. Our proposal here is upon a more practical plane at least than that. We are to restrict ourselves first to the limitations of human possibility as we know them in the men and women of this world today, and then to all the inhumanity, all the insubordination of nature. We are to shape our state in a world of uncertain seasons, sudden catastrophes, antagonistic diseases, and inimical beasts and vermin, out of men and women with like passions, like uncertainties of mood and desire to our own. And moreover, we are going to accept this world of conflict, to adopt no attitude of renunciation towards it, to face it in no ascetic spirit, but in the mood of the Western peoples, whose purpose is to survive and overcome. So much we adopt in common with those who deal not in utopias, but in the world of here and now. Certain liberties, however, following the best utopian precedents, we may take with existing fact. We assume that the tone of public thought may be entirely different from what it is in the present world. We permit ourselves a free hand with the mental conflict of life, within the possibilities of the human mind as we know it. We permit ourselves also a free hand with all the apparatus of existence that man has, so to speak, made for himself, with houses, roads, clothing, canals, machinery, with laws, boundaries, conventions and traditions, with schools, with literature and religious organization, with creeds and customs, with everything, in fact, that it lies within man's power to alter. That, indeed, is the cardinal assumption of all utopian speculations, old and new. The Republican laws of Plato and More's Utopia, Howell's implicit Altruria, and Bellamy's future Boston, Comte's great Western Republic, Hertzka's Freeland, Cabet's Icaria, and Campanella's City of the Sun, are built, just as we shall build, upon that, upon the hypothesis of the complete emancipation of a community of men from tradition, from habits, from legal bonds, and that subtler servitude possessions entail. And much of the essential value of all such speculations lies in this assumption of emancipation, lies in that regard towards human freedom, in the undying interest of the human power of self-escape, the power to resist the causation of the past and to evade, initiate, endeavour and overcome. Section 2. There are very definite artistic limitations also. There must always be a certain effect of hardness and thinness about utopian speculations. Their common fault is to be comprehensively jejune. That which is the blood and warmth and reality of life is largely absent. There are no individualities, but only generalized people. In almost every Utopia, except perhaps Morris's News from Nowhere, one sees handsome but characterless buildings, symmetrical and perfect cultivations, and a multitude of people, healthy, happy, beautifully dressed, but without any personal distinction whatever. Too often the prospect resembles the key to one of those large pictures of coronations, royal weddings, parliaments, conferences, and gatherings so popular in Victorian times, in which, instead of a face, each figure bears a neat oval with its index number legibly inscribed. This burdens us with an incurable effect of unreality, and I do not see how it is altogether to be escaped. It is a disadvantage that has to be accepted. Whatever institution has existed or exists, however irrational, however preposterous, has, by virtue of its contact with individualities, an effect of realness and rightness no untried thing may share. It has ripened, it has been christened with blood, it has been stained and mellowed by handling, it has been rounded and dented to the softened contours that we associate with life. It has been salted, may be, in a brine of tears. But the thing that is merely proposed, the thing that is merely suggested, however rational, however necessary, seems strange and inhuman in its clear, hard, uncompromising lines, its unqualified angles and surfaces. There is no help for it. There it is. The master suffers with the last and least of his successors. For all the humanity he wins to through his dramatic device of dialogue, I doubt if any one has ever been warmed to desire himself a citizen of the Republic of Plato. I doubt if any one could stand a month of the relentless publicity of virtue planned by More. No one wants to live in any community of intercourse really, save for the sake of the individualities he would meet there. The fertilizing conflict of individualities is the ultimate meaning of the personal life, and all our Utopias no more than schemes for bettering that interplay. At least, that is how life shapes itself more and more to modern perceptions. Until you bring in individualities, nothing comes into being, and the universe ceases when you shiver the mirror of the least of individual minds. Section 3. No less than a planet will serve the purpose of a modern Utopia. Time was when a mountain valley or an island seemed to promise sufficient isolation for a polity to maintain itself intact from outward force. The Republic of Plato stood armed ready for defensive war, and the new Atlantis and the Utopia of More, in theory, like China and Japan through many centuries of effectual practice, held themselves isolated from intruders. Such late instances as Butler's satirical Erewhon, and Mr. Stead's queendom of inverted sexual conditions in Central Africa, found the Tibetan method of slaughtering the inquiring visitor a simple sufficient rule. But the whole trend of modern thought is against the permanence of any such enclosures. We are acutely aware nowadays that, however subtly contrived a state may be, outside your boundary lines the epidemic, the breeding barbarian, or the economic power will gather its strength to overcome you. The swift march of invention is all for the invader. Now, perhaps you might still guard a rocky coast or a narrow pass. But what of that near tomorrow, when the flying machine soars overhead, free to descend at this point or that? A state powerful enough to keep isolated under modern conditions would be powerful enough to rule the world, would be indeed, if not actively ruling, yet passively acquiescent to all other human organizations, and so responsible for them altogether. World state, therefore, it must be. That leaves no room for a modern Utopia in Central Africa, or in South America, or round about the Pole, those last refuges of ideality. The floating isle of La Cité Moraliste no longer avails. We need a planet. Lord Erskine, the author of a Utopia, our martyr, that might have been inspired by Mr. Hewins, was the first of all utopists to perceive this. He joined his twin planets, pole to pole, by a sort of umbilical cord. But the modern imagination, obsessed by physics, must travel further than that. Out beyond Sirius, far in the deeps of space, beyond the flight of a cannon ball flying for 1 billion years, beyond the range of unaided vision, blazes the star that is our Utopia's sun. To those who know where to look, with a good opera glass aiding good eyes, it and 3 fellows that seem in a cluster with it, though they are incredible billions of miles nearer, make just the faintest speck of light. About it go planets, even as our planets, but weaving a different fate, and in its place among them is Utopia, with its sister mate, the moon. It is a planet like our planet, the same continents, the same islands, the same oceans and seas. Another Fuji-Yama is beautiful there, dominating another Yokohama, and another Matterhorn overlooks the icy disorder of another Theodule. It is so like our planet that a terrestrial botanist might find his every species there, even to the meanest pondweed or the remotest alpine blossom. Only when he had gathered the last and turned about to find his inn again, perhaps he would not find his inn. Suppose now that 2 of us were actually to turn about in just that fashion. 2, I think, for to face a strange planet, even though it be a wholly civilized one, without some other familiar backing, dashes the courage overmuch. Suppose that we were indeed so translated, even as we stood. You figure us upon some high pass in the Alps, and though I, being one easily made giddy by stooping, am no botanist myself, if my companion were to have a specimen tin under his arm, so long as it is not painted that abominable popular Swiss apple green, I would make it no occasion for quarrel. We have tramped and botanized and come to a rest, and sitting among rocks we have eaten our lunch and finished our bottle of Ivorn, and fallen into a talk of Utopias, and said such things as I have been saying. I could figure it myself upon that little neck of the Lucendro Pass, upon the shoulder of the Piz Lucendro, for there once I lunched and talked very pleasantly, and we were looking down upon the Val Bedretto, and Villa and Fontana and Airolo try to hide from us under the mountain side, 3/4 of a mile they are vertically below. Lantern. With that absurd nearness of effect one gets in the Alps, we see the little train 12 miles away, running down the Biaschina to Italy, and the Lacmanier Pass beyond Piora left of us, and the San Giacomo right, mere footpaths under our feet. And behold, in the twinkling of an eye, we are in that other world. We should scarcely note the change. Not a cloud would have gone from the sky. It might be the remote town below would take a different air, and my companion the botanist with his educated observation might almost see as much, and the train perhaps would be gone out of the picture, and the embanked straightness of the Ticino in the Ambri-Piotta meadows, that might be altered, but that would be all the visible change. Yet I have an idea that in some obscure manner we should come to feel at once a difference in things. The botanist's glance would, under a subtle attraction, float back to Airolo. "It's queer," he would say quite idly, "but I never noticed that building there to the right before." "Which building?" "That to the right, with a queer sort of thing." "I see it now. Yes. Yes, it's certainly an odd-looking affair. And big, you know. Handsome. I wondered." That would interrupt our Utopian speculations. We should both discover that the little towns below had changed, but how, we should not have marked them well enough to know. It would be indefinable, a change in the quality of their grouping, a change in the quality of their remote, small shapes. I should flick a few crumbs from my knee, perhaps. "It's odd," I should say, for the 10th or 11th time, with the motion to rise, and we should get up and stretch ourselves, and, still a little puzzled, turn our faces towards the path that clambers down over the tumbled rocks and runs round by the still clear lake, and down towards the hospice of St. Gothard, if perchance we could still find that path. Long before we got to that, before even we got to the great high road, we should have hints from the stone cabin in the nape of the pass. It would be gone, or wonderfully changed, from the very goats upon the rocks, from the little hut by the rough bridge of stone, that a mighty difference had come to the world of men. And presently, amazed and amazing, we should happen on a man, no Swiss, dressed in unfamiliar clothing, and speaking an unfamiliar speech. Section 4. Before nightfall we should be drenched in wonders, but still we should have wonder left for the thing my companion with his scientific training would no doubt be the first to see. I would glance up with that proprietary eye of a man who knows his constellations down to the little Greek letters. I imagine his exclamation. He would at first doubt his eyes. I should inquire the cause of his consternation, and it would be hard to explain. He would ask me with a certain singularity of manner for Orion, and I should not find him; for the Great Bear, and it would have vanished. Where? I should ask, and where? Seeking among that scattered starriness, and slowly I should acquire the wonder that possessed him. Then for the first time, perhaps, we should realize from this unfamiliar heaven that not the world had changed, but ourselves, that we had come into the uttermost deeps of space. Section 5. We need suppose no linguistic impediments to intercourse. The whole world will surely have a common language that is quite elementarily utopian, and since we are free of the trammels of convincing story-telling, we may suppose that language to be sufficiently our own to understand. Indeed, should we be in Utopia at all if we could not talk to everyone? That accursed bar of language, that hostile inscription in the foreigner's eyes, "Deaf and dumb to you, sir, and so your enemy," is the very first of the defects and complications one has fled the earth to escape. But what sort of language would we have the world speak, if we were told the miracle of Babel was presently to be reversed? If I may take a daring image, a medieval liberty, I would suppose that in this lonely place the spirit of creation spoke to us on this matter. "You are wise men," that spirit might say, and I, being a suspicious, touchy, over-earnest man for all my predisposition to plumpness, would instantly scent the irony, while my companion, I fancy, might even plume himself. "And to beget your wisdom is chiefly why the world was made. You are so good as to propose an acceleration of that tedious multitudinous evolution upon which I am engaged. I gather a universal tongue would serve you there. While I sit here among these mountains, I have been filing away at them for this last aeon or so, just to attract your hotels, you know. Will you be so kind? A few hints." Then the spirit of creation might transiently smile, a smile that would be like the passing of a cloud. All the mountain wilderness about us would be radiantly lit. You know those swift moments, when warmth and brightness drift by in lonely and desolate places. Yet, after all, why should two men be smiled into apathy by the infinite? Here we are with our knobby little heads, our eyes and hands and feet and stout hearts, and if not us or ours, still the endless multitudes about us and in our loins are to come at last to the world state and a greater fellowship in the universal tongue. Let us to the extent of our ability, if not answer that question, at any rate try to think ourselves within sight of the best thing possible. That, after all, is our purpose, to imagine our best and strive for it, and it is a worse folly and a worse sin than presumption to abandon striving because the best of all our bests looks mean amidst the suns. Now you as a botanist would, I suppose, incline to something, as they say, scientific. You wince under that most offensive epithet, and I am able to give you my intelligent sympathy, though pseudo-scientific and quasi-scientific are worse by far for the skin. You would begin to talk of scientific languages, of Esperanto, la langue bleue, New Latin, Volapuk, and Lord Lytton, of the philosophical language of Archbishop Whately, Lady Welby's work upon significs, and the like. You would tell me of the remarkable precisions, the encyclopedic quality of chemical terminology, and at the word terminology I should insinuate a comment on that eminent American biologist, Professor Mark Baldwin, who has carried the language biological to such heights of expressive clearness as to be triumphantly and invincibly unreadable, which foreshadows the line of my defence. You make your ideal clear, a scientific language you demand without ambiguity, as precise as mathematical formulae, and with every term in relations of exact logical consistency with every other. It will be a language with all the inflections of verbs and nouns regular, and all its constructions inevitable, each word clearly distinguishable from every other word in sound as well as spelling. That, at any rate, is the sort of thing one hears demanded, and if only because the demand rests upon implications that reach far beyond the region of language, it is worth considering here. It implies, indeed, almost everything that we are endeavouring to repudiate in this particular work. It implies that the whole intellectual basis of mankind is established, that the rules of logic, the systems of counting and measurement, the general categories and schemes of resemblance and difference, are established for the human mind for ever, blank Comteism, in fact, of the blankest description. But, indeed, the science of logic and the whole framework of philosophical thought men have kept since the days of Plato and Aristotle has no more essential permanence as a final expression of the human mind than the Scottish Longer Catechism. Amidst the welter of modern thought, a philosophy long lost to men rises again into being, like some blind and almost formless embryo that must presently develop sight and form and power, a philosophy in which this assumption is denied. The serious reader may refer at leisure to Sidgwick's use of words in reasoning, particularly, and to Bosanquet's Essentials of Logic, Bradley's Principles of Logic, and Sigwart's Logique. The lighter-minded may read and mark the temper of Professor Case in the British Encyclopaedia, article Logic, volume 30. I have appended to this book a rude sketch of a philosophy upon the new lines, originally read by me to the Oxford Philosophical Society in 1903. All through this Utopian excursion, I must warn you, you shall feel the thrust and disturbance of that insurgent movement. In the reiterated use of unique, you will, as it were, get the gleam of its integument. In the insistence upon individuality, and the individual difference as the significance of life, you will feel the texture of its shaping body. Nothing endures, nothing is precise and certain, except the mind of a pedant. Perfection is the mere repudiation of that ineluctable marginal inexactitude which is the mysterious inmost quality of being. Being, indeed! There is no being, but a universal becoming of individualities, and Plato turned his back on truth when he turned towards his museum of specific ideals. Heraclitus, that lost and misinterpreted giant, may perhaps be coming to his own. There is no abiding thing in what we know. We change from weaker to stronger lights, and each more powerful light pierces our hitherto opaque foundations and reveals fresh and different opacities below. We can never foretell which of our seemingly assured fundamentals the next change will not affect. What folly then to dream of mapping out our minds in however general terms, of providing for the endless mysteries of the future a terminology and an idiom. We follow the vein, we mine and accumulate our treasure, but who can tell which way the vein may trend? Language is the nourishment of the thought of man, that serves only as it undergoes metabolism, and becomes thought and lives, and in its very living passes away. You scientific people, with your fancy of a terrible exactitude in language, of indestructible foundations built, as that Wordsworthian doggerel on the title page of Nature says, for I, are marvellously without imagination. The language of Utopia will no doubt be one and indivisible. All mankind will, in the measure of their individual differences in quality, be brought into the same phase, into a common resonance of thought. But the language they will speak will still be a living tongue, an animated system of imperfections, which every individual man will infinitesimally modify. Through the universal freedom of exchange and movement, the developing change in its general spirit will be a world-wide change. That is the quality of its universality. I fancy it will be a coalesced language, a synthesis of many. Such a language as English is a coalesced language. It is a coalescence of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French and Scholars' Latin, welded into one speech, more ample and more powerful and beautiful than either. The Utopian tongue might well present a more spacious coalescence, and hold in the frame of such an uninflected or slightly inflected idiom as English already presents, a profuse vocabulary into which have been cast a dozen once separate tongues, superposed and then welded together through bilingual and trilingual promises. In the past, ingenious men have speculated on the inquiry, which language will survive? The question was badly put. I think now that this wedding and survival of several in a common offspring is a far more probable thing. Section 6. This talk of languages, however, is a digression. We were on our way along the faint path that runs round the rim of the lake of Lucendro, and we were just upon the point of coming upon our first Utopian man. He was, I said, no Swiss. Yet he would have been a Swiss on Mother Earth, and here he would have the same face, with some difference, maybe, in the expression, the same physique, though a little better developed, perhaps, the same complexion. He would have different habits, different traditions, different knowledge, different ideas, different clothing, and different appliances, but except for all that, he would be the same man. We very distinctly provided at the outset that the modern Utopia must have people inherently the same as those in the world. There is more, perhaps, in that than appears at the first suggestion. That proposition gives one characteristic difference between a modern Utopia and almost all its predecessors. It is to be a world Utopia, we have agreed, no less, and so we must needs face the fact that we are to have differences of race. Even the lower classes of Plato's Republic were not specifically of different race. But this is a Utopia as wide as Christian charity, and white and black, brown, red and yellow, all tints of skin, all types of body and character will be there. How we are to adjust their differences is a master question, and the matter is not even to be opened in this chapter. It will need a whole chapter even to glance at its issues. But here we underline that stipulation. Every race of this planet Earth is to be found in the strictest parallelism there, in numbers the same, only, as I say, with an entirely different set of traditions, ideals, ideas, and purposes, and so moving under those different skies to an altogether different destiny. There follows a curious development of this to anyone clearly impressed by the uniqueness and the unique significance of individualities. Races are no hard and fast things, no crowd of identically similar persons, but massed sub-races and tribes and families, each after its kind unique, and these again are clusterings of still smaller uniques, and so down to each several person. So that our first convention works out to this: not only is every earthly mountain, river, plant, and beast in that parallel planet beyond Sirius also, but every man, woman, and child alive has a Utopian parallel. From now onward, of course, the fates of these two planets will diverge. Men will die here whom wisdom will save there, and perhaps conversely here we shall save men. Children will be born to them, and not to us and not to them. But this, This moment of reading is the starting moment, and for the first and last occasion the populations of our planets are abreast. We must in these days make some such supposition. The alternative is a utopia of dolls in the likeness of angels, imaginary laws to fit incredible people, an unattractive undertaking. For example, we must assume there is a man such as I might have been, better informed, better disciplined, better employed, thinner and more active, and I wonder what he is doing. And you, sir or madam, are in duplicate also, and all the men and women that you know and I. I doubt if we shall meet our doubles, or if it would be pleasant for us to do so. But as we come down from these lonely mountains to the roads and houses and living places of the utopian world-state, we shall certainly find here and there faces that will remind us singularly of those who have lived under our eyes. There are some you never wish to meet again, you say, and some, I gather, you do. And one. It is strange, but this figure of the botanist will not keep in place. It sprang up between us, dear reader, as a passing illustrative invention. I do not know what put him into my head, and for the moment it fell in with my humour for a space to foist the man's personality upon you as yours, and call you scientific, that most abusive word. But here he is indisputably with me in Utopia, and lapsing from our high speculative theme into halting but intimate confidences. He declares he has not come to Utopia to meet again with his sorrows. What sorrows? I protest even warmly that neither he nor his sorrows were in my intention. He is a man, I should think, of 39, a man whose life has been neither tragedy nor a joyous adventure, a man with one of those faces that have gained interest rather than force or nobility from their commerce with life. He is something refined, with some knowledge, perhaps, of the minor pains and all the civil self-controls. He has read more than he has suffered, and suffered rather than done. He regards me with his blue-grey eye, from which all interest in this Utopia has faded. "It is a trouble," he says, "that has come into my life only for a month or so, at least acutely again. I thought it was all over. There was someone—" It is an amazing story to hear upon a mountain crest in Utopia, this Hampstead affair, this story of a Frognal heart. Frognal, he says, is the place where they met, and it summons to my memory the word on a board at the corner of a flint-dressed new road, an estate development road, with a vista of villas up a hill. He had known her before he got his professorship, and neither her people nor his (he speaks that detestable middle-class dialect in which aunts and things with money and the right of intervention are called people) approved of the affair. She was, I think, rather easily swayed, he says. But that's not fair to her, perhaps. She thought too much of others, if they seemed distressed, or if they seemed to think a course right. Have I come to Utopia to hear this sort of thing? Section 7. It is necessary to turn the botanist's thoughts into a worthier channel. It is necessary to override these modest regrets, this intrusive petty love story. Does he realize this is indeed Utopia? Turn your mind, I insist, to this Utopia of mine, and leave these earthly troubles to their proper planet. Do you realize just where the propositions necessary to a modern Utopia are taking us? Everyone on earth will have to be here themselves, but with a difference. Somewhere here in this world is, for example, Mr. Chamberlain, and the King is here, no doubt incognito, and all the Royal Academy, and Sandow, and Mr. Arnold White. But these famous names do not appeal to him. My mind goes from this prominent and typical personage to that, and for a time I forget my companion. I am distracted by the curious side issues this general proposition trails after it. There will be so-and-so, and so-and-so. The name and figure of Mr. Roosevelt jerks into focus, and obliterates an attempt to acclimatize the Emperor of the Germans. What, for instance, will Utopia do with Mr. Roosevelt? There drifts across my inner vision the image of a strenuous struggle with Utopian constables, the voice that has thrilled terrestrial millions in eloquent protest. The writ of arrest, drifting loose in the conflict, comes to my feet. I impale the scrap of paper and read. But can it be? Attempted disorganization? Incitements to disarrange the balance of population? The trend of my logic for once has led us into a facetious alley. One might indeed keep in this key, and write an agreeable little utopia, that, like the Holy Families of the medieval artists, or Michelangelo's Last Judgment, should compliment one's friends in various degrees. Or one might embark upon a speculative treatment of the entire Almanach de Gotha, something on the lines of Epistemon's vision of the damned great, when Xerxes was a crier of mustard, Romulus was a salter and a patcher of patterns. That incomparable catalogue, inspired by the muse of parody, we might go on to the pages of Who's Who, and even, with an eye to the obdurate Republic, to Who's Who in America, and make the most delightful and extensive arrangements. Now where shall we put this most excellent man, and this? But, indeed, it is doubtful if we shall meet any of these doubles during our Utopian journey, or know them when we meet them. I doubt if any one will be making the best of both these worlds. The great men in this still unexplored Utopia may be but village Hampdens in our own, and earthly goatherds and obscure illiterates sit here in the seats of the mighty. That again opens agreeable vistas left of us and right. But my botanist obtrudes his personality again. His thoughts have travelled by a different route. I know, he says, that she will be happier here, and that they will value her better than she's been valued upon earth. His interruption serves to turn me back from my momentary contemplation of those popular effigies, inflated by old newspapers and windy report, the earthly great. He sets me thinking of more personal and intimate applications of the human beings one knows, with a certain approximation to real knowledge of the actual common substance of life. He turns me to the thoughts of rivalries and tendernesses, of differences and disappointments. I am suddenly brought painfully against the things that might have been. What if, instead of that Utopia of vacant ovals, we meet relinquished loves here, and opportunities lost, and faces as they might have looked to us? I turn to my botanist almost reprovingly. You know, she won't be quite the same lady here that you knew in Frognal, I say, and wrest myself from a subject that is no longer agreeable by rising to my feet. And besides, I say, standing above him, the chances against our meeting her are 1,000,000 to 1, and we loiter. This is not the business we have come upon, but a mere incidental kink in our larger plan. The fact remains, these people we have come to see are people with like infirmities to our own, and only the conditions are changed. Let us pursue the tenor of our inquiry. With that, I lead the way round the edge of the lake of Lucendro towards our Utopian world. You figure him doing it. Down the valley we shall go, and down the passes, and as the valleys open, and the world will open, Utopia, where men and women are happy and laws are wise, and where all that is tangled and confused in human affairs has been unravelled and made right.
End of Chapter 1.
Chapter the second of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Recording by Christopher Taylor. Chapter the second. Concerning Freedoms. Section 1. Now what sort of question would first occur to two men descending upon the planet of a modern utopia? Probably grave solicitude about their personal freedom. Towards the stranger, as I have already remarked, the utopias of the past displayed their least amiable aspect. Would this new sort of utopian state, spread to the dimensions of a world, be any less forbidding? We should take comfort in the thought that universal toleration is certainly a modern idea, and it's upon modern ideas that this world state rests. But even suppose we are tolerated and admitted to this unavoidable citizenship, there will still remain a wide range of possibility. I think we should try to work the problem out from an inquiry into first principles, and that we should follow the trend of our time and kind by taking up the question as one of man versus the state, and discussing the compromise of liberty. The idea of individual liberty is one that has grown in importance and grows with every development of modern thought. To the classical utopists, freedom was relatively trivial. Clearly they considered virtue and happiness as entirely separable from liberty, and as being altogether more important things. But the modern view, with its deepening insistence upon individuality and upon the significance of its uniqueness, steadily intensifies the value of freedom, until at last we begin to see liberty as the very substance of life, that indeed it is life, and that only the dead things, the choiceless things, live in absolute obedience to law. To have free play for one's individuality is, in the modern view, the subjective triumph of existence, as survival in creative work and offspring is its objective triumph. But for all men, since man is a social creature, the play of will must fall short of absolute freedom. Perfect human liberty is possible only to a despot who is absolutely and universally obeyed. Then to will would be to command and achieve, and within the limits of natural law we could at any moment do exactly as it pleased us to do. All other liberty is a compromise between our own freedom of will and the wills of those with whom we come in contact. In an organized state, each one of us has a more or less elaborate code of what he may do to others and to himself, and what others may do to him. He limits others by his rights, and is limited by the rights of others, and by considerations affecting the welfare of the community as a whole. Individual liberty in a community is not, as mathematicians would say, always of the same sign. To ignore this is the essential fallacy of the cult called individualism. But in truth, a general prohibition in a state may increase the sum of liberty, and a general permission may diminish it. It does not follow, as these people would have us believe, that a man is more free where there is least law and more restricted where there is most law. A socialism or a communism is not necessarily a slavery, and there is no freedom under anarchy. Consider how much liberty we gain by the loss of the common liberty to kill. Thereby one may go to and fro in all ordered parts of the earth, unencumbered by arms or armor, free of the fear of playful poison, whimsical barbers, or hotel trap doors. Indeed, it means freedom from 1,000 fears and precautions. Suppose there existed even the limited freedom to kill in vendetta, and think what would happen in our suburbs. Consider the inconvenience of two households in a modern suburb, estranged and provided with modern weapons of precision. The inconvenience not only to each other, but to the neutral pedestrian, the practical loss of freedoms all about them. The butcher, if he came at all, would have to come round in an armoured cart. It follows, therefore, in A Modern Utopia, which finds the final hope of the world in the evolving interplay of unique individualities, that the state will have effectually chipped away just all those spendthrift liberties that waste liberty, and not one liberty more, and so have attained the maximum general freedom. There are two distinct contrasting methods of limiting liberty. The first is prohibition, thou shalt not, and the second command, thou shalt. There is, however, a sort of prohibition that takes the form of a conditional command, and this one needs to bear in mind. It says if you do so and so, you must also do so and so. If, for example, you go to sea with men you employ, you must go in a seaworthy vessel. But the pure command is unconditional. It says, whatever you have done, or are doing, or want to do, you are to do this. As when the social system, working through the base necessities of base parents and bad laws, sends a child of 13 into a factory. Prohibition takes one definite thing from the indefinite liberty of a man, but it still leaves him an unbounded choice of actions. He remains free, and you have merely taken a bucketful from the sea of his freedom. But compulsion destroys freedom altogether. In this utopia of ours, there may be many prohibitions, but no indirect compulsions, if one may so contrive it, and few or no commands. As far as I see it now, in this present discussion, I think, indeed, there should be no positive compulsions at all in utopia, at any rate for the adult utopian, unless they fall upon him as penalties incurred. Section 2. What prohibitions should we be under, we two Uitlanders in this utopian world? We should certainly not be free to kill, assault, or threaten anyone we met, and in that we earth-trained men would not be likely to offend. And until we knew more exactly the utopian idea of property, we should be very chary of touching anything that might conceivably be appropriated. If it was not the property of individuals, it might be the property of the state. But beyond that, we might have our doubts. Are we right in wearing the strange costumes we do, in choosing the path that pleases us athwart this rock and turf, in coming striding with unfumigated rucksacks and snow-wet hobnails into what is conceivably an extremely neat and orderly world? We have passed our first utopian now, with an answered vague gesture, and have noted, with secret satisfaction, there is no access of dismay. We have rounded a bend, and down the valley in the distance we get a glimpse of what appears to be a singularly well-kept road. I submit that to the modern-minded man it can be no sort of utopia worth desiring that does not give the utmost freedom of going to and fro. Free movement is to many people one of the greatest of life's privileges, to go wherever the spirit moves them, to wander and see. And though they have every comfort, every security, every virtuous discipline, they will still be unhappy if that is denied them. Short of damage to things cherished and made, the utopians will surely have this right, so we may expect no unclimbable walls and fences, nor the discovery of any laws we may transgress in coming down these mountain places. And yet, just as civil liberty itself is a compromise defended by prohibitions, so this particular sort of liberty must also have its qualifications. Carried to the absolute pitch, the right of free movement ceases to be distinguishable from the right of free intrusion. We have already, in a comment on More's Utopia, hinted at an agreement with Aristotle's argument against communism, that it flings people into an intolerable continuity of contact. Schopenhauer carried out Aristotle in the vein of his own bitterness, and with the truest of images when he likened human society to hedgehogs clustering for warmth, and unhappy when either too closely packed or too widely separated. Empedocles found no significance in life whatever, except as an unsteady play of love and hate, of attraction and repulsion, of assimilation and the assertion of difference. So long as we ignore difference, so long as we ignore individuality, and that, I hold, has been the common sin of all utopias hitherto, we can make absolute statements, prescribe communisms or individualisms, and all sorts of hard theoretic arrangements. But in the world of reality, which, to modernize Heraclitus and Empedocles, is nothing more nor less than the world of individuality, there are no absolute rights and wrongs, there are no qualitative questions at all, but only quantitative adjustments. Equally strong in the normal civilized man is the desire for freedom of movement, and the desire for a certain privacy, for a corner definitely his, and we have to consider where the line of reconciliation comes. The desire for absolute personal privacy is perhaps never a very strong or persistent craving. In the great majority of human beings, the gregarious instinct is sufficiently powerful to render any but the most temporary isolations not simply disagreeable, but painful. The savage has all the privacy he needs within the compass of his skull. Like dogs and timid women, he prefers ill treatment to desertion, and it is only a scarce and complex modern type that finds comfort and refreshment in quite lonely places and quite solitary occupations. Yet such there are, men who can neither sleep well nor think well, nor attain to a full perception of beautiful objects, who do not savor the best of existence until they are securely alone. And for the sake of these, even it would be reasonable to draw some limits to the general right of free movement. But their particular need is only a special and exceptional aspect of an almost universal claim to privacy among modern people. Not so much for the sake of isolation, as for congenial companionship. We want to go apart from the great crowd, not so much to be alone, as to be with those who appeal to us particularly, and to whom we particularly appeal. We want to form households and societies with them, to give our individualities play and intercourse with them, and in the appointments and furnishings of that intercourse. We want gardens and enclosures and exclusive freedoms for our like and our choice, just as spacious as we can get them. And it is only the multitudinous uncongenial, anxious also for similar developments in some opposite direction, that checks this expansive movement of personal selection and necessitates a compromise on privacy. Glancing back from our utopian mountainside down which this discourse marches, to the confusions of old earth, we may remark that the need and desire for privacies there is exceptionally great at the present time, that it was less in the past, that in the future it may be less again, and that under the utopian conditions to which we shall come when presently we strike yonder road, it may be reduced to quite manageable dimensions. But this is to be effected not by the suppression of individualities to some common pattern. Footnote: More's Utopia, quote, "Whoso will may go in, for there is nothing within the houses that is private or any man's own," unquote. But by the broadening of public charity and the general amelioration of mind and manners. It is not by assimilation, that is to say, but by understanding that the modern utopia achieves itself. The ideal community of man's past was one with a common belief, with common customs and common ceremonies, common manners and common formulae, men of the same society dressed in the same fashion, each according to his defined and understood grade, behaved in the same fashion, loved, worshipped, and died in the same fashion. They did or felt little that did not find a sympathetic publicity. The natural disposition of all peoples, white, black, or brown, a natural disposition that education seeks to destroy, is to insist upon uniformity, to make publicity extremely unsympathetic to even the most harmless departures from the code, to be dressed odd, to behave oddly, to eat in a different manner or of different food, to commit, indeed, any breach of the established convention, is to give offence and to incur hostility among unsophisticated men. But the disposition of the more original and enterprising minds at all times has been to make such innovations. This is particularly in evidence in this present age. The almost cataclysmal development of new machinery, the discovery of new materials, and the appearance of new social possibilities through the organized pursuit of material science, has given enormous and unprecedented facilities to the spirit of innovation. The old local order has been broken up, or is now being broken up all over the earth, and everywhere societies deliquesce, everywhere men are afloat amidst the wreckage of their flooded conventions, and still tremendously unaware of the thing that has happened. The old local orthodoxies of behaviour, of precedence, the old accepted amusements and employments, the old ritual of conduct in the important small things of the daily life, and the old ritual of thought in the things that make discussion, are smashed up and scattered and mixed discordantly together, one use with another, and no world-wide culture of toleration, no courteous admission of differences, no wider understanding has yet replaced them. And so publicity in the modern earth has become confusedly unsympathetic for everyone. Classes are intolerable to classes, and sets to sets. Contact provokes aggressions, comparisons, persecutions, and discomforts. And the subtler people are excessively tormented by a sense of observation, unsympathetic always and often hostile. To live without some sort of segregation from the general mass is impossible in exact proportion to one's individual distinction. Of course, things will be very different in Utopia. Utopia will be saturated with consideration. To us, clad as we are in mountain-soiled tweeds and with no money but British banknotes negotiable only at a practically infinite distance, this must needs be a reassuring induction. And utopian manners will not only be tolerant, but almost universally tolerable. Endless things will be understood perfectly and universally, that on earth are understood only by a scattered few. Baseness of bearing, grossness of manner, will be the distinctive mark of no section of the community whatever. The coarser reasons for privacy, therefore, will not exist here, and that savage sort of shyness, too, that makes so many half-educated people on earth recluse and defensive, that, too, the Utopians will have escaped by their more liberal breeding. In the cultivated state, we are assuming it will be ever so much easier for people to eat in public, rest and amuse themselves in public, and even work in public. Our present need for privacy in many things marks, indeed, a phase of transition from an ease in public in the past due to homogeneity, to an ease in public in the future due to intelligence and good breeding, and in Utopia that transition will be complete. We must bear that in mind throughout the consideration of this question. Yet, after this allowance has been made, there still remains a considerable claim for privacy in Utopia. The room, or apartment, or home, or mansion, whatever it may be a man or woman maintains, must be private, and under his or her complete dominion. It seems harsh and intrusive to forbid a central garden plot or peristyle, such as one sees in Pompeii, within the house walls, and it is almost as difficult to deny a little private territory beyond the house. Yet if we concede that, it is clear that without some further provision we concede the possibility that the poorer townsman, if there are to be rich and poor in the world, will be forced to walk through endless miles of high-fenced villa gardens before he may expand in his little scrap of reserved open country. Such is already the poor Londoner's miserable fate. Our Utopia will have, of course, faultless roads and beautifully arranged interurban communications, swift trains or motor services or what not, to diffuse its population, and without some anticipatory provisions, the prospect of the residential areas becoming a vast area of defensively walled Villa Edens is all too possible. This is a quantitative question, be it remembered, and not to be dismissed by any statement or principle. Our Utopians will meet it, I presume, by detailed regulations, very probably varying locally with local conditions. Privacy beyond the house might be made a privilege to be paid for in proportion to the area occupied, and the tax on these licenses of privacy might increase as the square of the area affected. A maximum fraction of private enclosure for each urban and suburban square mile could be fixed. A distinction could be drawn between an absolute private garden and a garden private enclosed only for a day or a couple of days a week, and at other times open to the well-behaved public, who, in a really civilized community, would grudge that measure of invasion. Walls could be taxed by height and length, and the enclosure of really natural beauties, of rapids, cascades, gorges, viewpoints, and so forth made impossible. So a reasonable compromise between the vital and conflicting claims of the freedom of movement and the freedom of seclusion might be attained. And as we argue, thus we draw nearer and nearer to the road that goes up and over the Gothard crest and down the Val Tremolot towards Italy. What sort of road would that be? Section 3. Freedom of movement in a utopia planned under modern conditions must involve something more than unrestricted pedestrian wanderings, and the very proposition of a world state speaking one common tongue carries with it the idea of a world population travelled, and travelling to an extent quite beyond anything our native earth has seen. It is now our terrestrial experience that whenever economic and political developments set a class free to travel, that class at once begins to travel. In England, for example, above the £500 or £600 a year level, it is hard to find anyone who is not habitually migratory, who has not been frequently, as people say, abroad. In the modern utopia, travel must be in the common texture of life. To go into fresh climates and fresh scenery, to meet a different complexion of humanity and a different type of home and food and apparatus, to mark unfamiliar trees and plants and flowers and beasts, to climb mountains, to see the snowy night of the north and the blaze of the tropical midday, to follow great rivers, to taste loneliness in desert places, to traverse the gloom of tropical forests and to cross the high seas will be an essential part of the reward and adventure of life, even for the commonest people. This is a bright and pleasant particular in which a modern utopia must differ again, and differ diametrically from its predecessors. We may conclude from what has been done in places upon our earth that the whole utopian world will be open and accessible and as safe for the wayfarer as France or England is today. The peace of the world will be established forever and everywhere. Except in remote and desolate places, there will be convenient inns, at least as convenient and trustworthy as those of Switzerland today. The touring clubs and hotel associations that have tariffed that country and France so effectually will have had their fine utopian equivalents, and the whole world will be habituated to the coming and going of strangers. The greater part of the world will be as secure and cheaply and easily accessible to everyone as is Zermatt or Lucerne to a Western European of the middle class at the present time. On this account alone, no places will be so congested as these two are now on earth. With freedom to go everywhere, with easy access everywhere, with no dread of difficulties about language, coinage, custom or law, why should everyone continue to go to just a few special places? Such congestions are merely the measure of the general inaccessibility and insecurity and costliness of contemporary life, an awkward transitory phase in the first beginnings of the travel age of mankind. No doubt the utopian will travel in many ways. It is unlikely there will be any smoke-disgorging steam railway trains in Utopia. They are already doomed on Earth, already threatened with that obsolescence that will endear them to the Ruskins of tomorrow. But a thin spider's web of inconspicuous special routes will cover the land of the world, pierce the mountain masses, and tunnel under the seas. These may be double railways or monorails or whatnot. We are no engineers to judge between such devices, but by means of them, the utopian will travel about the earth from one chief point to another at a speed of 200 or 300 miles or more an hour. That will abolish the greater distances. One figures these main communications as something after the manner of corridor trains, smooth running and roomy, open from end to end, with cars in which one may sit and read, cars in which one may take refreshment, cars into which the news of the day comes printing itself from the wires beside the track, cars in which one may have privacy and sleep if one is so disposed, bathroom cars, library cars, a train as comfortable as a good club. There will be no distinctions of class in such a train, because in a civilized world there would be no offence between one kind of man and another. And for the good of the whole world such travelling will be as cheap as it can be, and well within the reach of any but the almost criminally poor. Such great tramways as this will be used when the utopians wish to travel fast and far. Thereby you will glide all over the land surface of the planet, and feeding them and distributing from them innumerable minor systems, clean little electric tramways I picture them, will spread out over the land in finer reticulations, growing close and dense in the urban regions and thinning as the population thins. And running beside these lighter railways, and spreading beyond their range, will be the smooth minor high roads such as this one we now approach, upon which independent vehicles, motor cars, cycles and what not will go. I doubt if we shall see any horses upon this fine, smooth, clean road. I doubt if there will be many horses on the high roads of Utopia, and indeed, if they will use draft horses at all upon that planet. Why should they? Where the world gives turf and sand, or along special tracks, the horse will perhaps be ridden for exercise and pleasure, but that will be all the use for him. And as for the other beast of burthen, on the remoter mountain tracks the mule will no doubt still be a picturesque survival. In the desert, men will still find a use for the camel, and the elephant may linger to play a part in the pageant of the East, but the burthen of the minor traffic, if not the whole of it, will certainly be mechanical. This is what we shall see even while the road is still remote. Swift and shapely motor cars going past, cyclists, and in these agreeable mountain regions there will also be pedestrians upon their way. Cycle tracks will abound in Utopia, sometimes following beside the great high roads, but oftener taking their own more agreeable line amidst woods and crops and pastures. And there will be a rich variety of footpaths and minor ways. There will be many footpaths in Utopia. There will be pleasant ways over the scented needles of the mountain pine woods. Primrose-strewn tracks amid the budding thickets of the lower country. Paths running beside rushing streams. Paths across the wide spaces of the cornland. And above all, paths through the flowery garden spaces amidst which the houses and the towns will stand. And everywhere about the world, on road and path, by sea and land, the happy holiday utopians will go. The population of Utopia will be a migratory population beyond any earthly precedent. Not simply a traveling population, but migratory. The old Utopias were all localized as a parish councillor. But it is manifest that nowadays even quite ordinary people live over areas that would have made a kingdom in those former days, would have filled the Athenian of laws with incredulous astonishment. Except for the habits of the very rich during the Roman Empire, there was never the slightest precedent for this modern detachment from place. It is nothing to us that we go 80 or 90 miles from home to a place of business, or take an hour's spin of 50 miles to our week-end golf. Every summer has become a fixed custom to travel wide and far. Only the clumsiness of communications limit us now. And every facilitation of locomotion widens not only our potential, but our habitual range. Not only this, but we change our habitations with a growing frequency and facility. To Sir Thomas More, we should seem a breed of nomads, a trick of rooting man learnt from a time from his new-found friends. The corn and the vine and the hearth, the untamed spirit of the young, has turned for ever to wandering in the sea. The soul of man has never yet in any land been willingly adscript to the glebe. Even Mr. Belloc, who preaches the happiness of a peasant proprietary, is so much wiser than his thoughts that he sails about the seas in a little yacht, or goes afoot from Belgium to Rome. We are winning our freedom again once more, a freedom renewed and enlarged, and there is now neither necessity nor advantage in a permanent life servitude to this place or that. Men may settle down in our modern utopia for love and the family at last, but first and most abundantly they will see the world. And with this loosening of the fetters of a locality from the feet of men, necessarily there will be all sorts of fresh distributions of the factors of life. On our own poor haphazard earth, wherever men work, wherever there are things to be grown, minerals to be won, power to be used, there, regardless of all the joys and decencies of life, the household's needs must cluster. But in Utopia there will be wide stretches of cheerless or unhealthy or toilsome or dangerous land, with never a household. There will be regions of mining and smelting, black with the smoke of furnaces, and gashed and desolated by mines, with a sort of weird, inhospitable grandeur of industrial desolation, and the men will come thither and work for a spell and return to civilization again, washing and changing their attire in the swift gliding train. And by way of compensation there will be beautiful regions of the earth specially set apart and favoured for children. In them the presence of children will remit taxation, while in other less wholesome places the presence of children will be taxed. The lower passes and forehills of these very Alps, for example, will be populous with homes, serving the vast arable levels of Upper Italy. So we shall see, as we come down by our little lake in the Lapalissandro, and even before we reach the road, the first scattered chalets and households in which these migrant people live, the upper summer homes. With the coming of summer, as the snows on the high Alps recede, a tide of households and schools, teachers and doctors, and all such attendant services will flow up the mountain masses, and ebb again when the September snows return. It is essential to the modern ideal of life that the period of education and growth should be prolonged to as late a period as possible, and puberty correspondingly retarded, and by wise regulation the statesmen of Utopia will constantly adjust and readjust regulations and taxation to diminish the proportion of children reared in hot and stimulating conditions. These high mountains will, in the bright sweet summer, be populous with youth. Even up towards this high place where the snow is scarce gone until July, these households will extend, and below, the whole long valley of Urseren will be a scattered summer town. One figures one of the more urban highways, one of those along which the light railways of the second order run, such as that in the valley of Urseren, into which we should presently come. I figure it as one would see it at night, a band, 100 yards perhaps in width, the footpath on either side shaded with high trees and lit softly with orange glow lights, while down the centre the tramway of the road will go, with sometimes a nocturnal tramcar gliding, lit and gay but almost noiselessly past. Lantern-lit cyclists will flit along the track like fireflies, and ever and again some humming motor car will hurry by, to or from the Rhoneland or the Rhineland or Switzerland or Italy. Away on either side the lights of the little country homes up the mountain slopes will glow. I figure it at night, because so it is we should see it first. We should come out of our mountain valley into the minor road that runs down the lonely rock wilderness of the St. Gothard Pass. We should descend that 9 miles of winding route, and so arrive towards twilight among the clustering homes and upland unenclosed gardens of Raup and Hospenthal and Andermatt. Between Raup and Andermatt, and down the Skolinen gorge, the greater road would run. By the time we reached it, we should be in the way of understanding our adventure a little better. We should know already, when we saw those 2 familiar clusters of chalets and hotels replaced by a great dispersed multitude of houses, we should see their window lights, but little else. That we were the victims of some strange transition in space or time, and we should come down by dimly seen buildings into the part that would answer to Hospenthal. wondering and perhaps a little afraid. We should come out into this great main roadway, this roadway like an urban avenue, and look up it and down, hesitating whether to go along the valley Furkaward, or down by Andermatt through the gorge that leads to Golskonen. People would pass us in the twilight, and then more people. We should see they walked well and wore a graceful, unfamiliar dress, but more we could not distinguish. "Good night," they would say to us in clear, fine voices. Their dim faces would turn with a passing scrutiny towards us. We should answer out of our perplexity, "Good night," for by the conventions established in the beginning of this book, we are given the freedom of their tongue. Chapter the second of A Modern Utopia, sections 4 through 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christopher Taylor. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter the second. Concerning Freedoms. Section 4. Were this a story, I should tell at length how much we were helped by the good fortune of picking up a utopian coin of gold. How at last we had ventured into the utopian inn and found it all marvellously easy. You see us the shyest and most watchful of guests, but of the food they put before us, and the furnishings of the house, and all our entertainment, it will be better to speak later. We are in a migratory world, we know, one greatly accustomed to foreigners. Our mountain clothes are not strange enough to attract acute attention, though ill-made and shabby. No doubt, by utopian standards, we are dealt with as we might best wish to be dealt with, that is to say, as rather untidy, inconspicuous men. We look about us and watch for hints and examples, and indeed get through with the thing. And after a queer, yet not unpleasant dinner, in which we remark no meet figures, we go out of the house for a breath of air and for quiet counsel with one another. And there it is we discover those strange constellations overhead. It comes to us then, clear and full, that our imagination has realized itself. We dismiss quite finally a Rip Van Winkle fancy we have entertained. All the unfamiliarities of our descent from the mountain pass gather together into one fullness of conviction. And we know we are in Utopia. We wander under the trees by the main road, watching the dim passers-by as though they were the phantoms of a dream. We say little to one another. We turn aside into a little pathway and come to a bridge over the turbulent Rhys, hurrying down towards the Devil's Bridge in the gorge below. Far away over the Furka ridge a pallid glow preludes the rising of the moon. Two lovers pass us whispering, and we follow them with our eyes. This utopia has certainly preserved the fundamental freedom to love. And then a sweet-voiced bell from somewhere high up towards Oberalp chimes 22 times. I break the silence. That might mean 10 o'clock, I say. My companion leans upon the bridge and looks down into the dim river below. I become aware of the keen edge of the moon like a needle of incandescent silver creeping over the crest, and suddenly the river is alive with flashes. He speaks, and astonishes me with the hidden course his thoughts have taken. We too were boy and girl lovers like that, he says, and jerks ahead at the receding utopians. I loved her first, and I do not think I have ever thought of loving anyone but her. It is a curiously human thing, and upon my honor, not one I had designed, that when at last I stand in the twilight in the midst of a utopian township, when my whole being should be taken up with speculative wonder, this man should be standing by my side and lugging my attention persistently towards himself, towards his limited, futile self. This thing perpetually happens to me. This intrusion of something small and irrelevant and alive upon my great impressions. The time I first saw the Matterhorn, that queen among the Alpine summits, I was distracted beyond appreciation by the tale of a man who could not eat sardines. Always sardines did this with him and that. And my first wanderings along the brown streets of Pompeii, an experience I had anticipated with a strange intensity, was shot with the most stupidly intelligent discourse on vehicular tariffs in the chief capitals of Europe that it is possible to imagine. And now this man, on my first night in Utopia, talks and talks and talks of his poor little love affair. It shapes itself as the most trite and feeble of tragedies, one of those stories of effortless submission to chance and custom in which Mr. Hardy or George Gissing might have found a theme. I do but half listen at first, watching the black figures in the moonlit roadway pacing to and fro. Yet, I cannot trace how he conveys the subtle conviction to my mind. The woman he loves is beautiful. They were boy and girl together, and afterward they met again as fellow students in a world of comfortable discretions. He seems to have taken the decorums of life with a confiding good faith, to have been shy and innocent in a suppressed sort of way, and of a mental type not made for worldly successes. But he must have dreamt about her and loved her well enough. How she felt for him I could never gather. It seemed to be all of that fleshless friendliness into which we train our girls. Then abruptly happened stresses. The man who became her husband appeared, with a very evident passion. He was a year or so older than either of them, and he had the habit and quality of achieving his ends. He was already successful, and with a promise of wealth. And I, at least, perceived, from my botanist's phrasing, that his desire was for her beauty. As my botanist talked, I seemed to see the whole little drama rather clearer than his words gave it me. The actors all absurdly in Hampstead middle-class raiment, meetings of a Sunday after church, the men in silk hats, frock coats, and tightly rolled umbrellas, rare excursions into evening dress, the decorously vulgar fiction read in their homes, its ambling sentimentalities of thought, the amiably worldly mothers, the respectable fathers, the aunts, the people, his people, and her people, the piano music and the song. And in this setting our friend, quite clever at botany, and going in for it as a profession, and the girl, gratuitously beautiful. So I figured the arranged and orderly environment into which this claw of an elemental force had thrust itself to grip. The stranger who had come in got what he wanted. The girl considered that she thought she had never loved the botanist, had had only friendship for him, though little she knew of the meaning of those fine words. They parted a little incoherently and in tears, and it had not occurred to the young man to imagine she was not going off to some conventional life in some other of the endless frognals he imagined as the cellular tissue of the world. But she wasn't. He had kept her photograph and her memory sweet, and if ever he strayed from the severest constancy, it seemed only in the end to strengthen with the stuff of experience, to enhance by comparative disappointment his imagination of what she might have meant to him. Then 8 years afterward, they met again. By the time he gets to this part of his story, we have, at my initiative, left the bridge and are walking towards the Utopian guest house. The Utopian guest house. His voice rises and falls, and sometimes he holds my arm. My attention comes and goes. "Good night," two sweet-voiced Utopians cry to us in their universal tongue, and I answer them, "Good night." "You see," he persists, "I saw her only a week ago. It was in Lucerne, while I was waiting for you to come on from England. I talked to her 3 or 4 times altogether, and her face, the change in her, I can't get it out of my head, night or day. The miserable waste of her. Before us, through the tall pine stems, shine the lights of our Utopian inn. He talks vaguely of ill usage. The husband is vain, boastful, dishonest to the very confines of the law, and a drunkard. There are scenes and insults. She told you. Not much, but someone else did. He brings other women almost into her presence to spite her. And it's going on, I interrupt. Yes, now. Need it go on? What do you mean? Lady in trouble, I say. Night at hand. Why not stop this dismal grizzling and carry her off? You figure the heroic sweep of the arm that belongs to the voice. I positively forget for the moment that we are in Utopia at all. You mean, take her away from him. What's all this emotion of yours worth if it isn't equal to that? Positively he seems aghast at me. Do you mean elope with her? It seems a most suitable case. For a space he is silent, and we go on through the trees. A Utopian tramcar passes, and I see his face, poor bitted wretch, looking pinched and scared in its trailing glow of light. That's all very well in a novel, he says. But how could I go back to my laboratory, mixed classes with young ladies, you know, after a thing like that? How could we live, and where could we live? We might have a house in London, but who would call upon us? Besides, you don't know her. She is not the sort of woman. Don't think I'm timid or conventional. Don't think I don't feel. Feel? You don't know what it is to feel in a case of this sort. He halts, and then flies out viciously. There are times when I could strangle him with my hands. Which is nonsense. He flings out his lean, botanizing hands in an impotent gesture. My dear man, I say, and say no more. For a moment, I forget we are in Utopia altogether. Section 5. Let us come back to Utopia. We were speaking of travel. Besides roadways and railways and tramways, for those who go to and fro in the earth, the modern utopians will have very many other ways of travelling. There will be rivers, for example, with a vast variety of boats, canals with diverse sorts of haulage. There will be lakes and lagoons, and when one comes at last to the borders of the land, the pleasure craft will be there, coming and going, and the swift great passenger vessels, very big and steady, doing 30 knots an hour or more, will trace long wakes as they go dwindling out athwart the restless vastness of the sea. They will be just beginning to fly in Utopia. We owe much to M. Santos Dumont. The world is immeasurably more disposed to believe this wonder is coming, and coming nearly, than it was 5 years ago. But unless we are to suppose utopian scientific knowledge far in advance of ours, and though that supposition was not proscribed in our initial undertaking, it would be inconvenient for us and not quite in the vein of the rest of our premises, they, too, will only be in the same experimental stage as ourselves. In Utopia, however, they will conduct research by the Army Corps while we conduct it. We don't conduct it, we let it happen. Fools make the researches and wise men exploit them. That is our earthly way of dealing with the question, and we thank heaven for an assumed abundance of financially impotent and sufficiently ingenious fools. In Utopia, a great multitude of selected men, chosen volunteers, will be collaborating upon this new step in man's struggle with the elements. Bacon's visionary House of Solomon, footnote, in the new Atlantis, will be a thing realized, and it will be humming with this business. Every university in the world will be urgently working for priority in this aspect of the problem or that. Reports of experiments, as full and as prompt as the telegraphic reports of cricket in our more sportive atmosphere, will go about the world. All this will be passing, as it were, behind the act drop of our first experience, behind this first picture of the urbanized Ursarin Valley. The literature of the subject will be growing and developing with the easy swiftness of an eagle's swoop as we come down the hillside. Unseen in that twilight, unthought of by us until this moment, 1,000 men at 1,000 glowing desks, a busy specialist press, will be perpetually sifting, criticizing, condensing, and clearing the ground for further speculation. Those who are concerned with the problems of public locomotion will be following these aeronautic investigations with a keen and enterprising interest, and so will the psychologist and the sociologist. That utopian research will, I say, go like an eagle's swoop in comparison with the blind man's fumbling of our terrestrial way. Even before our own brief utopian journey is out, we may get a glimpse of the swift ripening of all this activity that will be in progress at our coming. Tomorrow, perhaps, or in a day or so, some silent distant thing will come gliding into view over the mountains, will turn and soar and pass again beyond our astonished sight. Section 6. But my friend in his great trouble turned my mind from these questions of locomotion and the freedoms that cluster about them. In spite of myself, I find myself framing his case. He is a lover, the most conventional of Anglican lovers, with a heart that has had its training, I should think, in the clean but limited schoolroom of Mrs. Henry Wood. In Utopia, I think they will fly with stronger pinions. It will not be in the superficialities of life merely that movement will be wide and free. They will mount higher and swoop more steeply than he in his cage can believe. What will their range be, their prohibitions? What jars to our preconceptions will he and I receive here? My mind flows with the free, thin flow that it has at the end of an eventful day, and as we walk along in silence towards our inn, I rove from issue to issue. I find myself ranging amidst the fundamental things of the individual life and all the perplexity of desires and passions. I turn my questionings to the most difficult of all sets of compromises, those mitigations of spontaneous freedom that constitute the marriage laws, the mystery of balancing justice against the good of the future, amidst these violent and elusive passions. Where falls the balance of freedoms here? I pass for a time from utopianizing altogether to ask the question that, after all, Schopenhauer failed completely to answer. Why sometimes in the case of hurtful, pointless and destructive things we want so vehemently. I come back from this unavailing glance into the deeps, to the general question of freedoms in this new relation. I find myself far adrift from the case of the frognal botanist, and asking how far a modern utopia will deal with personal morals. As Plato demonstrated long ago, the principles of the relation of state control to personal morals may be best discussed in the case of intoxication, the most isolated and least complicated of all this group of problems. But Plato's treatment of this issue as a question of who may or may not have the use of wine, though suitable enough in considering a small state in which everybody was the effectual inspector of everybody, is entirely beside the mark under modern conditions, in which we are to have an extraordinarily higher standard of individual privacy and an amplitude and quantity of migration inconceivable to the academic imagination. We may accept his principle and put this particular freedom of the use of wine among the distinctive privileges of maturity, and still find all that a modern would think of as the drink question untouched. That question in Utopia will differ perhaps in the proportion of its factors, but in no other respect from what it is upon earth. The same desirable ends will be sought: the maintenance of public order and decency, the reduction of inducements to form this bad and wasteful habit to their lowest possible minimum, and the complete protection of the immature. But the modern utopians, having systematized their sociology, will have given some attention to the psychology of minor officials, a matter altogether too much neglected by the social reformer on earth. They will not put into the hands of a common policeman powers direct and indirect that would be dangerous to the public in the hands of a judge, and they will have avoided the immeasurable error of making their control of the drink traffic a source of public revenue. Privacies they will not invade, but they will certainly restrict the public consumption of intoxicants to specified licensed places, and the sale of them to unmistakable adults, and they will make the temptation of the young a grave offence. In so migratory a population as the modern utopian, the licensing of inns and bars would be under the same control as the railways and high roads. Inns exist for the stranger, and not for the locality, and we shall meet with nothing there to correspond with our terrestrial absurdity of local option. The utopians will certainly control this trade, and as certainly punish personal excesses. Public drunkenness, as distinguished from the mere elation that follows a generous but controlled use of wine, will be an offence against public decency, and will be dealt with in some very drastic manner. It will, of course, be an aggravation of, and not an excuse for, crime. But I doubt whether the state will go beyond that. Whether an adult shall use wine or beer or spirits or not, seems to me entirely a matter for his doctor and his own private conscience. I doubt if we explorers shall meet any drunken men, and I doubt not we shall meet many who have never availed themselves to their adult freedom in this respect. The conditions of physical happiness will be better understood in Utopia. It will be worth while to be well there, and the intelligent citizen will watch himself closely. Half and more of the drunkenness of earth is an attempt to lighten dull days and hopelessly sordid and disagreeable lives. And in Utopia they do not suffer these things. Assuredly, Utopia will be temperate, not only drinking, but eating with the soundest discretion. Yet I do not think wine and good ale will be altogether wanting there, nor good mellow whisky, nor upon occasion the engaging various liqueur. I do not think so. My botanist, who abstains altogether, is of another opinion. We differ here and leave the question to the earnest reader. I have the utmost respect for all teetotalers, prohibitionists, and haters, and persecutors of innkeepers. Their energy of reform awakens responsive notes in me, and to their species I look for a large part of the urgent repair of our earth. Yet for all that, there is Burgundy, for example, a bottle of soft and kindly Burgundy, taken to make a sunshine on one's lunch when 4 strenuous hours of toil have left one on the further side of appetite. Or ale, a foaming tankard of ale, 10 miles of sturdy trampling in the sleet and slush as a prelude, and then good bread, and good butter, and ripe hollow Stilton, and celery and ale with a certain quantitative freedom. Or, again, where is the sin in a glass of tawny port 3 or 4 times, or it may be 5, a year, when the walnuts come round in their season? If you drink no port, then what are walnuts for? Such things I hold for the reward of vast intervals of abstinence. They justify your wide, immaculate margin, which is else a mere unmeaning blankness on the page of palate God has given you. I write of these things as a fleshly man, confessedly and knowingly fleshly, and more than usually aware of my liability to err. I know myself for a gross creature, more given to sedentary world mending than to brisk activities, and not 1/10 as active as the dullest newspaper boy in London. Yet still I have my uses that vanish in monotony, and still I must ask, why should we bury the talent of these bright sensations altogether? Under no circumstances can I think of my utopians maintaining their fine order of life on ginger ale and lemonade, and the ale that is copses. Those terrible temperance drinks, solutions of qualified sugar mixed with vast volumes of gas, as, for example, soda, seltzer, lemonade, and fire extinctors, hand grenades, minerals, they call such stuff in England. Fill a man with wind and self-righteousness. Indeed they do. Coffee destroys brain and kidney, a fact now universally recognized and advertised throughout America. And tea, except for a kind of green tea best used with discretion in punch, tans the entrails and turns honest stomachs into leather bags. Rather would I be Metchnikoffed. Footnote. See The Nature of Man by Professor Eli Metchnikoff. At once, and have a clean, good stomach of German silver. No, if we are to have no ale in Utopia, give me the one good clean temperance drink that is worthy to set beside wine, and that is simple water. Best it is when not quite pure and with a trace of organic matter, for then it tastes and sparkles. My botanist would still argue. Thank heaven this is my book, and that the ultimate decision rests with me. It is open to him to write his own Utopia, and arrange that everybody shall do nothing except by the consent of the savants of the Republic, either in his eating, drinking, dressing, or lodging, even as Cabot proposed. It is open to him to try a news from nowhere Utopia, with the wine left out. I have my short way with him here quite effectually. I turn in the entrance of our inn to the civil but by no means obsequious landlord, and with a careful ambiguity of manner, for the thing may be considered an outrage, and I try to make it possible the idea is a jest, put my test demand. You see, my dear teetotaler. He sets before me tray and glass, and here follows the necessary experiment with a deep sigh. Yes, a bottle of quite excellent light beer. So there are also cakes and ale in Utopia. Let us in this saner and more beautiful world drink perdition to all earthly excesses. Let us drink more particularly to the coming of the day when men beyond there will learn to distinguish between qualitative and quantitative questions, to temper good intentions with good intelligence, and righteousness with wisdom. One of the darkest evils of our world is surely the unteachable wildness of the good. Section 7. So presently to bed and to sleep, but not at once to sleep. At first my brain, like a dog in unfamiliar quarters, must turn itself round for a time or so before it lies down. This strange mystery of a world of which I have seen so little as yet, a mountain slope, a twilit road, a traffic of ambiguous vehicles and dim shapes, the window lights of many homes, fills me with curiosities. Figures and incidents come and go, the people we have passed, our landlord, quietly attentive and yet, I feel, with the keenest curiosity peeping from his eyes, the unfamiliar forms of the house parts and furnishings, the unfamiliar courses of the meal. Outside this little bedroom is a world, a whole unimagined world. 1,000 million things lie outside in the darkness beyond this lit inn of ours, unthought of possibilities, overlooked considerations, surprises, riddles, incommensurables. A whole monstrous, intricate universe of consequences that I have to do my best to unravel. I attempt impossible recapitulations and mingle the weird quality of dream stuff with my thoughts. Athwart all this tumult of my memory goes this queer figure of my unanticipated companion, so obsessed by himself and his own egotistical love that the sudden change to another world seems only a change of scene for his gnawing, uninvigorating passion. It occurs to me that she must also have an equivalent in Utopia, and then that idea and all ideas grow thin and vague, and are dissolved at last in the rising tide of sleep. End of chapter the 2nd. Sections 4 through 7. Recording by Christopher Taylor.
Chapter 3 of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daniel Todd. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter 3. Chapter the 3rd. Utopian Economics. These modern utopians, with the universally diffuse good manners, the universal education, the fine freedoms we shall ascribe to them, their world unity, world language, worldwide travellings, worldwide freedom of sale and purchase, will remain mere dream stuff, incredible even by twilight, until we have shown that at that level the community will still sustain itself. At any rate, the common liberty of the utopians will not embrace the common liberty to be unserviceable. The most perfect economy of organisation still leaves the fact untouched that all order and security in a state rests on the certainty of getting work done. How will the work of this planet be done? What will be the economics of a modern utopia? Now, in the first place, a state so vast and complex as this world utopia, and with so migratory a people, will need some handy symbol to check the distribution of services and commodities. Almost certainly they will need to have money. They will have money, and it is not inconceivable that for all his sorrowful thoughts, our botanist, with his trained observation, his habit of looking at little things upon the ground, would be the one to see and pick up the coin that has fallen from some wayfarer's pocket. This, in our first hour or so, before we reach the inn in the Useran Tal, Euphigerus, upon the high Gotthard road, heads together over the little disc that contrives to tell us so much of this strange world. It is, I imagine, of gold, and it will be a convenient accident if it is sufficient to make us solvent for a day or so, until we are a little more informed of the economic system into which we have come. It is, moreover, of a fair round size, and the inscription declares it one lion, equal to 20 bronze crosses. Unless the ratio of metals is very different here, this latter must be a token coin, and therefore legal tender for but a small amount. That would be a pain and pleasure to Mr. Wordsworth Donisthorpe if he were to chance to join us, for once he planned a utopian coinage. Footnote: a system of measures by Wordsworth Donisthorpe, and the words lion and cross are his. But a token coinage and legal tender he cannot abide. They make him argue, and being in Utopia, that unfamiliar 20 suggests at once we have come upon that most utopian of all things, a duodecimal system of counting. My author's privilege of detail serves me here. This lion is distinctly a beautiful coin, admirably made, with its value in fine clear letters circling the obverse side, and a head thereon of Newton as I live. One detects American influence here. Each year, as we shall find, each denomination of coins celebrates a centenary. The reverse shows the universal goddess of the utopian coinage, Peace as a beautiful woman, reading with a child out of a great book, and behind them are stars and an hourglass halfway run. Very human, these utopians, after all, and not by any means above the obvious in their symbolism. So for the first time we learn definitely of the world state, and we get our first clear hint too that there is an end to kings. But our coin raises other issues also. It would seem that this utopia has no simple community of goods. that there is, at any rate, a restriction upon what one may take, a need for evidences of equivalent value, a limitation to human credit. It dates. So much of this present utopia of ours dates. Those former utopists were bitterly against gold. You will recall the undignified use Sir Thomas More would have us put it to, and how there was no money at all in the Republic of Plato, and in that later community for which he wrote his laws, an iron coinage of austere appearance and doubtful efficacy. It may be these great gentlemen were a little hasty, with a complicated difficulty, and not a little unjust to a highly respectable element. Gold is abused and made into vessels of dishonour, and abolished from ideal society, as though it were the cause instead of the instrument of human baseness. But, indeed, there is nothing bad in gold. Making gold into vessels of dishonour, and banishing it from the state, is punishing the hatchet for the murderous crime. Money, did you but use it right, is a good thing in life, a necessary thing in civilized human life, as complicated, indeed, for its purposes, but as natural a growth as the bones in a man's wrist. And I do not see how one can imagine anything at all worthy of being called a civilization without it. It is the water of the body social. It distributes and receives, and renders growth and assimilation and movement and recovery possible. It is the reconciliation of human interdependence with liberty. What other device will give a man so great a freedom, with so strong an inducement to effort? The economic history of the world, where it is not the history of the theory of property, is very largely the record of the abuse, not so much of money as of credit devices to supplement money, to amplify the scope of this most precious invention, and no device of labour credits. Footnote, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, Chapter 10, or Free Demand of Commodities from a Central Store. Footnote, More's Utopia and Cabet's Icaria, or the like, has ever been suggested that does not give 10,000 times more scope for that inherent moral dross in man that must be reckoned within any sane utopia we may design and plan. Heaven knows where progress may not end, but at any rate, this developing state, into which we two men have fallen, this 20th century utopia, has still not passed beyond money and the use of coins. Chapter 2. Now, if this utopian world is to be in some degree parallel to contemporary thought, it must have been concerned, it may still be concerned, with many unsettled problems of currency, and with the problems that centre about a standard of value. Gold is perhaps of all material substances the best adapted to the monetary purpose, but even at that best it falls far short of an imaginable ideal. It undergoes spasmodic and irregular cheapening through new discoveries of gold, and at any time it may undergo very extensive and sudden disastrous depreciation through the discovery of some way of transmuting less valuable elements. This liability to such depreciations introduces an undesirable speculative element into the relations of debtor and creditor. When on one hand there is for a time a check in the increase of available stores of gold, or an increase in the energy applied to social purposes, or a checking of public security that would impede the free exchange of credit and necessitate a more frequent production of gold in evidence Then there comes an undue appreciation of money as against the general commodities of life, and an automatic impoverishment of the citizens in general as against the creditor class. The common people are mortgaged in the bondage of debt, and on the other hand, an unexpected spate of gold production, and the discovery of a single nugget as big as St. Paul's, let us say, a quite possible thing, would result in a sort of jail delivery of debtors and a financial earthquake. It has been suggested by an ingenious thinker that it is possible to use as a standard of monetary value no substance whatever, but instead force, and that value might be measured in units of energy. An excellent development this, in theory, at any rate, of the general idea of the modern state as kinetic and not static. It throws the old idea of the social order and the new into the sharpest antithesis. The old order is presented as a system of institutions and classes ruled by men of substance, the new, of enterprises and interests led by men of power. Now I glance at this matter in the most incidental manner, as a man may skim through a specialist exposition in a popular magazine. You must figure me, therefore, finding from a casual periodical paper in our inn, with a certain surprise at not having anticipated as much, the utopian self of that same ingenious person, quite conspicuously a leader of thought, and engaged in organising the discussion of the currency changes Utopia has under consideration. The article, as it presents itself to me, contains a complete and lucid, though occasionally rather technical, explanation of his newest proposals. They have been published, it seems, for general criticism, and one gathers that in the modern Utopia the administration presents the most elaborately detailed schemes of any proposed alteration in law or custom, some time before any measure is taken to carry into effect, and the possibilities of every detail are acutely criticised, flaws anticipated, side issues raised, and the whole minutely tested and fined down by a planetful of critic, before the actual process of legislation begins. The explanation of these proposals involves an anticipatory glance at the local administration of modern Utopia. To anyone who has watched the development of technical science during the last decade or so, there will be no shock in the idea that a general consolidation of a great number of common public services over areas of considerable size is now not only practicable, but very desirable. In a little while heating and lighting, and the supply of power for domestic and industrial purposes and for urban and interurban communications will all be managed electrically from common generating stations, and the trend of political and social speculation points decidedly to the conclusion that so soon as it passes out of the experimental stage, the supply of electrical energy, just like drainage and the supply of water, will fall to the local authority. Moreover, the local authority will be the universal landowner. Upon that point, so extreme an individualist as Herbert Spencer was in agreement with the socialist. In Utopia, we conclude that, whatever other types of property may exist, all natural sources of force, and indeed all strictly natural products, coal, water power, and the like, are inalienably vested in the local authorities, which, in order to secure the maximum of convenience and administrative efficiency, will probably control areas as large as sometimes half of England. They will generate electricity by water power, by combustion, by wind or tide, or whatever other natural force is available, and this electricity will be devoted, some of it to the authorities' lighting and other public works, some of it as a subsidy to the world state authority which controls the high roads, the great railways, the inns and other apparatus of world communication, and the rest will pass on to private individuals or to distributing companies at a uniform fixed rate for private lighting and heating, for machinery and industrial applications of all sorts. Such an arrangement of affairs will necessarily involve a vast amount of bookkeeping between the various authorities, the world state government and the customers, and this bookkeeping will naturally be done most conveniently in units of physical energy. It is not incredible that the assessment of the various local administrations for the central world government would be already calculated upon the estimated total of energy periodically available in each locality and booked and spoken of in these physical units. Accounts between central and local governments could be kept in these terms. Moreover, one may imagine utopian local authorities making contracts in which payment would be no longer in coinage upon the gold basis, but in notes good for so many thousands of millions of units of energy at one or other of the generating stations. Now, the problems of economic theory will have undergone an enormous clarification if, instead of measuring in fluctuating money values, the same scale of energy units can be extended to their discussion, if in fact the idea of trading could be entirely eliminated. In my utopia, at any rate, this has been done. The production and distribution of common commodities have been expressed as a problem in the conversion of energy, and the scheme that Utopia was now discussing was the application of this idea of energy as a standard of value to the entire utopian coinage. Every one of those giant local authorities was to be free to issue energy notes against the security of its surplus of saleable available energy, and to make all its contracts for payment in those notes up to a certain maximum defined by the amount of energy produced and disposed of in that locality in the previous year. This power of issue was to be renewed just as rapidly as the notes came in for redemption. In a world without boundaries, with a population largely migratory and emancipated from locality, the price of the energy notes of these various local bodies would constantly tend to be uniform, because employment would constantly shift into the areas where energy was cheap. Accordingly, the price of so many millions of units of energy at any particular moment in coins of the gold currency would be approximately the same throughout the world. It was proposed to select some particular day when the economic atmosphere was distinctly equable, and to declare a fixed ratio between the gold coinage and the energy notes, each gold line and each line of credit representing exactly the number of energy units it could buy on that day. The old gold coinage was at once to cease to be legal tender beyond certain defined limits, except to the central government, which would not reissue it as it came in. It was, in fact, to become a temporary token coinage of full value for the day of conversion at any rate, if not afterwards, under the new standard of energy, and to be replaceable by an ordinary token coinage as time went on. The old computation by Lyons and the value of the small change of daily life were therefore to suffer no disturbance whatsoever. The communists of Utopia as I apprehended them, had a different method and a different system of theories from those I read on earth, and this makes my exposition considerably more difficult. This article, upon which I base my account, floated before me in an unfamiliar, perplexing, and dreamlike phraseology. Yet I brought away an impression that here was a rightness that earthly economists have failed to grasp. Few earthly economists have been able to disentangle themselves from patriotisms and politics, and their obsession has always been international trade. Here in Utopia, the world state cuts that away from beneath their feet. There are no imports but meteorites, and no exports at all. Trading is the earthly economist's initial notion, and they start from perplexing and insoluble riddles about exchange value. Insoluble because of all trading finally involves individual preferences which are incalculable and unique. Nowhere do they seem to be handling the really defined standards. Every economic dissertation and discussion reminds one more strongly than the last of the game of croquet Alice played in Wonderland, when the mallets were flamingos and the balls were hedgehogs and crawled away, and hoops were soldiers and kept getting up and walking about. But economics in Utopia must be, it seems to me, not a theory of trading based on bad psychology, but physics applied to problems in the theory of sociology. The general problem of utopian economics is to state the conditions of the most efficient application of the steadily increasing quantities of material energy the progress of science makes available for human service to the general needs of mankind. Human labour and existing material are dealt with in relation to that. Trading and relative wealth are merely episodical in such a scheme. The trend of the article I read, as I understood it, was that a monetary system based upon a relatively small amount of gold, upon which the business of the whole world had hitherto been done, fluctuated unreasonably and supplied no real criterion of well-being, that the nominal values of things and enterprises had no clear and simple relation to the real physical prosperity of the community, that the nominal wealth of a community in millions of pounds or dollars or lions measured nothing but the quantity of hope in the air, and an increase of confidence meant an inflation of credit, and a pessimistic phase a collapse of the hallucination of possessions. The new standards, this advocate reasoned, were to alter all that, and it seemed to me they would. I have tried to indicate the drift of these remarkable proposals, but about them clustered an elaborate mass of keen and temperate discussion. Into the details of that discussion I will not enter now, nor am I sure I am qualified to render the multitudinous aspect of this complicated question at all precisely. I read the whole thing in the course of an hour or two of rest after lunch. It was either the second or third day of my stay in Utopia, and we were sitting in a little inn at the end of the Lake of Uri. We had loitered there, and I had fallen reading because of a shower of rain. But certainly, as I read it, the proposition struck me as a singularly simple and attractive one, and its exposition opened out to me for the first time clearly, in a comprehensive outline, the general conception of the economic nature of the utopian state. Chapter 3. The difference between the social and economic sciences as they exist in our world, footnote, but see Gidding's Principles of Sociology, a modern and richly suggested American work imperfectly appreciated by the British student. See also Walter Bagehot's Economic Studies. And in this utopia deserves perhaps a word or so more. I write with the utmost diffidence because upon earth economic science has been raised to a very high level of tortuous abstraction by the industry of its professors, and I can claim neither a patient student's intimacy with their productions nor, what is more serious, anything but the most generalized knowledge of what their utopian equivalents have achieved. The vital nature of economic issues to a utopia necessitates, however, some attempts at interpretation between the two. In utopia, there is no distinct and separate science of economics. Many problems that we should regard as economic come within the scope of utopian psychology. My utopians make two divisions of the science of psychology. First, the general psychology of individuals, a sort of mental physiology separated by no definite line from physiology proper. And secondly, the psychology of relationships between individuals. This second is an exhaustive study of the reaction of people upon each other and of all possible relationships. It is a science of human aggregations, of possible family groupings, of neighbours and neighbourhood, of companies, associations, unions, secret and public societies, religious groupings, and common ends and intercourse, and of the methods of intercourse and collective decision that hold human groups together, and finally of government and the state. The elucidation of economic relationships, depending as it does on the nature of the hypothesis of human aggregation actually in operation at any time, is considered to be subordinate and subsequent to this general science of sociology. Political economy and economics in our world now consists of a hopeless muddle of social assumptions and preposterous psychology, and a few geographical and physical generalizations. Its ingredients will be classified out and widely separated in utopian thought. On the one hand, there will be a study of physical economies, ending in the descriptive treatment of society as an organization for the conversion of all the available energy in nature to the material ends of mankind. A physical sociology, which will be already at such a stage of practical development as to be giving the world this token coinage representing energy. And on the other, there will be the study of economic problems as problems in the division of labour, having regard to a social organisation whose main ends are reproduction and education in an atmosphere of personal freedom. Each of these inquiries, working unencumbered by the other, will be continually contributing fresh valid conclusions for the use of the practical administrator. In no region of intellectual activity will our hypothesis of freedom from tradition be of more value in devising a utopia than here. From its beginning, the earthly study of economics has been infertile and unhelpful, because of the mass of unanalyzed and scarcely suspected assumption upon which it rested. The facts were ignored that trade is a byproduct and not an essential factor in social life, that property is a plastic and fluctuating convention, that value is capable of impersonal treatment only in the case of the most generalized requirements. Wealth was measured by the standards of exchange. Society was regarded as a practically unlimited number of avaricious adult units incapable of any other subordinate groupings than business partnerships, and the sources of competition were assumed to be inexhaustible. Upon such quicksands rose an edifice that ate the securities of material science, developed a technical jargon, and professed the discovery of laws. Our liberation from these false presumptions through the rhetoric of Carlyle and Ruskin and the activities of the socialists is more apparent than real. The old edifice oppresses us still, repaired and altered by indifferent builders, underpinned in places and with a slight change of name. Political economy has been painted out, and instead we read economics under entirely new management. Modern economics differs mainly from old political economy in having produced no Adam Smith. The old political economy made certain generalizations, and they were mostly wrong. New economics evades generalizations and seems to lack the intellectual power to make them. The science hangs like a gathering fog in a valley, a fog which begins nowhere and goes nowhere, an incidental, unmeaning inconvenience to passers-by. Its most typical exponents display a disposition to disavow generalizations altogether, to claim consideration as experts, and to make immediate political application of that conceded claim. Now, Newton, Darwin, Dalton, Davy, Joule, and Adam Smith did not affect this expert hanky-panky, becoming enough in a hairdresser or a fashionable physician, but indecent in a philosopher or a man of science. In this state of impotent expertness, however, or in some equally unsound state, economics must struggle on, a science that is no science, a floundering law wallowing in a mud of statistics, until either the study of the material organization of production, on the one hand as a development of physics and geography, or the study of social aggregation on the other, renders enduring foundations possible. Chapter 4. The old utopias were all relatively small state. Plato's Republic, for example, was to be smaller than the average English borough, and no distinction was made between the family, the local government, and the state. Plato and Campanella, for all that the latter was a Christian priest, carried communism to its final point, and prescribed even a community of husbands and wives, an idea that was brought at last to the test of effectual experiment in the Oneida community of New York State, 1848-1879. This latter body did not long survive its founder, at least as a veritable communism, by reason of the insurgent individualism of its vigorous sons. More too denied privacy and ruled an absolute community of goods, at any rate, and so coming to the Victorian utopias de Cabet. But Cabet's communism was one of the free store type, and the goods were yours only after you had requisitioned them. That seems the case in the Nowhere of Morris also. Compared with the older writers, Bellamy and Morris have a vivid sense of individual separation, and their departure from the old homogeneity is sufficiently marked to justify a doubt whether there will be any more thoroughly communist utopias forever. A utopia such as this present one, written in the opening of the 20th century, and after the most exhaustive discussion, nearly a century long, between communist and socialistic ideas on the one hand, and individualism on the other, emerges upon a sort of effectual conclusion to those controversies. The two parties have so chipped and amended each other's initial propositions that, indeed, except for the labels still fluttering adhesive to the implicated men, it is hard to choose between them. Each side established a good many propositions, and we profit by them all. We of the succeeding generation can see quite clearly that for the most part the heat and zeal of these discussions arose in the confusion of a quantitative for a qualitative question. To the onlooker, both individualism and socialism are, in the absolute, absurdities. The one would make men the slaves of the violent or rich, the other the slaves of the state official. And the way of sanity runs, perhaps even sinuously, down the intervening valley. Happily the dead past buries its dead, and it is not our function now to adjudicate the preponderance of victory. In the very days when our political and economic order is becoming steadily more socialistic, our ideals of intercourse turn more and more to a fuller recognition of the claims of individuality. The state is to be progressive, it is no longer to be static, and this alters the general condition of the utopian problem profoundly. We have to provide not only for food and clothing, for order and health, but for initiative, the factor that leads the world state on from one phase of development to the next is the interplay of individualities. To speak teleologically, the world exists for the sake of and through initiative, and individuality is the method of initiative. Each man and woman, to the extent that his or her individuality is marked, breaks the law of precedent, transgresses the general formula, and makes a new experiment for the direction of the life force. It is impossible, therefore, for the state, which represents all and is preoccupied by the average, to make effectual experiments and intelligent innovations, and so supply the essential substance of life. As against the individual, the state represents the species. In the case of the utopian world state, it absolutely represents the species. The individual emerges from the species, makes his experiment, and either fails, dies, and comes to an end, or succeeds and impresses himself in offspring, in consequences and results, intellectual, material, and moral, upon the world. Biologically, the species is the accumulation of the experiments of all its successful individuals since the beginning, and the world state of the modern utopist will, in its economic aspect, be a compendium of established economic experience about which individual enterprise will be continually experimenting, either to fail and pass, or to succeed and at last become incorporated with the undying organism of the world state. This organism is the universal rule, the common restriction, the rising level platform on which individualities stand. The world state in this ideal presents itself as the sole landowner of the earth. With the great local governments I have adumbrated, the local municipalities holding, as it were, feudally under it as landlords. The state or these subordinates hold all the sources of energy, and either directly or through its tenants, farmers and agents, develops these sources and renders the energy available for the work of life. It or its tenants will produce food, and so human energy and the exploitation of coal and electric power and the powers of wind and wave and water will be within its right. It will pour out this energy by assignment and lease and acquiescence and what not upon its individual citizens. It will maintain order, maintain roads, maintain a cheap and efficient administration of justice, maintain cheap and rapid locomotion, and be the common carrier of the planet, convey and distribute labour, control, let or administer all natural productions, pay for and secure healthy births and a healthy and vigorous new generation, maintain the public health, coin money, and sustain standards of measurements, subsidise research, and reward such commercially unprofitable undertakings as benefit the community as a whole, subsidise when needful chairs of criticism and authors and publication, and collect and distribute information. The energy developed and the employment afforded by the state will descend like water that the sun has sucked out of the sea to fall upon a mountain range, and back to the sea again it will come at last, debauching in ground rent and royalty and licence fees, in the fees of travellers and profit upon carrying and coinage and the like, in death duty, transfer tax, legacy and forfeiture, returning to the sea. Between the clouds and the sea it will run as a river system down through a great region of individual enterprise and interplay, whose freedom it will sustain. In that immediate region, between the kindred heights and deeps, those beginnings and promises will arise that are the essential significance, the essential substance of life. From a human point of view, the mountains and sea are for the habitable lands that lie between. So likewise the state is for individualities. The state is for individuals. The law is for freedoms. The world is for experiment, experience, and change. These are fundamental beliefs upon which a modern utopia must go. End of Chapter 3. Utopian Economics, Sections 1 to 4. Recording by Daniel Todd.
Chapter 3, Utopian Economics, Sections 5 through 8, of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Modern Utopia, by H.G. Wells. Chapter 3, Utopian Economics, Sections 5 through 8. Section 5. Within this scheme, which makes the state the source of all energy, and the final legatee, what will be the nature of the property a man may own? Under modern conditions, indeed under any conditions, a man without some negotiable property is a man without freedom, and the extent of his property is very largely the measure of his freedom. Without any property, without even shelter or food, a man has no choice but to set about getting these things. He is in servitude to his needs, until he has secured property to satisfy them. But with a certain small property a man is free to do many things, to take a fortnight's holiday when he chooses, for example, and to try this new departure from his work or that. With so much more he may take a year of freedom and go to the ends of the earth. With so much more he may obtain elaborate apparatus and try curious novelties, build himself houses and make gardens, establish businesses and make experiments at large. Very speedily, under terrestrial conditions, the property of a man may reach such proportions that his freedom oppresses the freedom of others. Here, again, is a quantitative question, an adjustment of conflicting freedoms, a quantitative question that too many people insist on making a qualitative one. The object sought in the code of property laws that one would find in operation in Utopia would be the same object that pervades the whole Utopian organization, namely, a universal maximum of individual freedom. Whatever far-reaching movements the state or great rich men or private corporations may make, the starvation by any complication of employment, the unwilling deportation, the destruction of alternatives to servile submissions must not ensue. Beyond such qualifications, the object of modern Utopian statesmanship will be to secure to a man the freedom given by all his legitimate property, that is to say, by all the values his toil or skill or foresight and courage have brought into being. Whatever he has justly made he has a right to keep. That is obvious enough. But he will also have a right to sell and exchange, and so this question of what may be property takes really the form of what may a man buy in Utopia. A modern Utopian most assuredly must have a practically unqualified property in all those things that become, as it were by possession, extensions and expressions of his personality. His clothing, his jewels, the tools of his employment, his books, the objects of art he may have bought or made, his personal weapons, if Utopia have need of such things, insignia, and so forth. All such things that he has bought with his money or acquired, provided he is not a professional or habitual dealer in such property, will be inalienably his to give or lend or keep, free even from taxation. So intimate is this sort of property that I have no doubt Utopia will give a man posthumous rights over it, will permit him to assign it to a successor with at the utmost the payment of a small redemption. A horse, perhaps, in certain districts, or a bicycle, or any such mechanical conveyance personally used, the Utopians might find it well to rank with these possessions. No doubt, too, a house and privacy owned and occupied by a man, and even a man's own household furniture, might be held to stand as high or almost as high in the property scale, might be taxed as lightly and transferred under only a slightly heavier redemption, provided he had not let these things on hire, or otherwise alienated them from his intimate self. A thoroughgoing democratic socialist will no doubt be inclined at first to object that if the Utopians make these things a specially free sort of property in this way, men would spend much more upon them than they would otherwise do. But indeed that will be an excellent thing. We are too much affected by the needy atmosphere of our mismanaged world. In Utopia, no one will have to hunger because some love to make and have made and own and cherish beautiful things. To give this much of property to individuals will tend to make clothing, ornamentation, implements, books, and all the arts finer and more beautiful, because by buying such things a man will secure something inalienable, save in the case of bankruptcy, for himself and for those who belong to him. Moreover, a man may in his lifetime set aside sums to ensure special advantages of education and care for the immature children of himself and others, and in this manner also exercise a posthumous right. Footnote: but a statute of Mortmain will set a distinct time limit to the continuance of such benefactions. A periodic revision of endowments is a necessary feature in any modern Utopia. End footnote. For all other property, the Utopians will have a scantier respect. Even money unspent by a man, and debts to him that bear no interest, will at his death stand upon a lower level than these things. What he did not choose to gather and assimilate to himself, or assign for the special education of his children, the state will share in the lion's proportion with heir and legatee. This applies, for example, to the property that a man creates and acquires in business enterprises, which are presumably undertaken for gain, and as a means of living rather than for themselves. All new machinery, all new methods, all uncertain and variable and non-universal undertakings are no business for the state. They commence always as experiments of unascertained value, and next after the invention of money, there is no invention has so facilitated freedom and progress as the invention of the limited liability company to do this work of trial and adventure. The abuses, the necessary reforms of company law on earth are no concern of ours here and now. Suffice it that in a modern Utopia such laws must be supposed to be as perfect as mortal laws can possibly be made. Caveat vendor will be a sound qualification of caveat emptor in the beautifully codified Utopian law. Whether the Utopian company will be allowed to prefer this class of share to that, or to issue debentures, whether indeed usury, that is to say, lending money at fixed rates of interest, will be permitted at all in Utopia, one may venture to doubt. But whatever the nature of the shares a man may hold, they will all be sold at his death, and whatever he has not clearly assigned for special educational purposes will, with possibly some fractional concession to near survivors, lapse to the state. The safe investment, that permanent, undying claim upon the community, is just one of those things Utopia will discourage, which indeed the developing security of civilization quite automatically discourages through the fall in the rate of interest. As we shall see at a later stage, the state will insure the children of every citizen, and those legitimately dependent upon him, against the inconvenience of his death. It will carry out all reasonable additional dispositions he may have made for them in the same event, and it will insure him against old age and infirmity. And the object of Utopian economics will be to give a man every inducement to spend his surplus money in intensifying the quality of his surroundings, either by economic adventures and experiments which may yield either losses or large profits, or in increasing the beauty, the pleasure, the abundance, and promise of life. Besides strictly personal possessions and shares in business adventures, Utopia will no doubt permit associations of its citizens to have a property in various sorts of contracts and concessions, in leases of agricultural and other land, for example, in houses they may have built, factories and machinery they may have made, and the like. And if a citizen prefer to adventure into business single-handed, he will have all the freedoms of enterprise enjoyed by a company. In business affairs he will be a company of one, and his single share will be dealt with at his death like any other shares. So much for the second kind of property. And these two kinds of property will probably exhaust the sorts of property a Utopian may possess. The trend of modern thought is entirely against private property, in land or natural objects or products, and in Utopia these things will be the inalienable property of the world-state. Subject to the rights of free locomotion, land will be leased out to companies or individuals, but, in view of the unknown necessities of the future, never for a longer period than, let us say, 50 years. The property of a parent in his children, and of a husband in his wife, seems to be undergoing a steadily increasing qualification in the world of to-day, but the discussion of the Utopian state of affairs in regard to such property may be better reserved until marriage becomes our topic. Suffice it here to remark that the increasing control of a child's welfare and upbringing by the community, and the growing disposition to limit and tax inheritance, are complementary aspects of the general tendency to regard the welfare and free intraplay of future generations no longer as the concern of parents and altruistic individuals, but as the predominant issue of statesmanship, and the duty and moral meaning of the world community as a whole. Section 6. From the conception of mechanical force as coming in from nature to the service of man, a conception the Utopian proposal of a coinage based on energy units would emphasize, arise profound contrasts between the modern and the classical Utopias. Except for a meagre use of water power for milling, and the wind for sailing, so meagre in the latter case that the classical world never contrived to do without the galley slave, and a certain restricted help from oxen in ploughing, and from horses in locomotion, all the energy that sustained the old-fashioned state was derived from the muscular exertion of toiling men. They ran their world by hand. Continual bodily labor was a condition of social existence. It is only with the coming of coal-burning, of abundant iron and steel, and of scientific knowledge that this condition has been changed. Today, I suppose, if it were possible to indicate in units of energy the grand total of work upon which the social fabric of the United States or England rests, it would be found that a vastly preponderating moiety is derived from non-human sources, from coal and liquid fuel, and explosives, and wind and water. There is every indication of a steady increase in this proportion of mechanical energy, in this emancipation of men from the necessity of physical labor. There appears no limit to the invasion of life by the machine. Now it is only in the last 300 years that any human being seems to have anticipated this. It stimulates the imagination to remark how entirely it was overlooked as a modifying cause in human development. [Footnote: It is interesting to note how little even Bacon seems to see of this in his New Atlantis.] Plato clearly had no ideas about machines at all as a force affecting social organization. There was nothing in his world to suggest them to him. I suppose there arose no invention, no new mechanical appliance or method of the slightest social importance through all his length of years. He never thought of a state that did not rely for its force upon human muscle, just as he never thought of a state that was not primarily organized for warfare hand to hand. Political and moral inventions he saw enough of and to spare, and in that direction he still stimulates the imagination. But in regard to all material possibilities he deadens rather than stimulates. [Footnote: The lost Utopia of Hippodamus provided rewards for inventors, but unless Aristotle misunderstood him, and it is certainly the fate of all Utopias to be more or less misread, the inventions contemplated were political devices. An infinitude of nonsense about the Greek mind would never have been written, if the distinctive intellectual and artistic quality of Plato's time, its extraordinarily clear definition of certain material conditions as absolutely permanent, coupled with its politico-social instability, had been borne in mind. The food of the Greek imagination was the very antithesis of our own nourishment. We are educated by our circumstances to think no revolution in appliances and economic organization incredible. Our minds play freely about the possibilities that would have struck the men of the Academy as outrageous extravagance, and it is in regard to politico-social expedients that our imaginations fail. Sparta, for all the evidence of history, is scarcely more credible to us than a motor car throbbing in the Agora would have been to Socrates. By sheer inadvertence, therefore, Plato commenced the tradition of Utopias without machinery, a tradition we find Morris still loyally following, except for certain mechanical barges and such like toys, in his News from Nowhere. There are some foreshadowings of mechanical possibilities in the New Atlantis, but it is only in the 19th century that Utopias appeared in which the fact is clearly recognized that the social fabric rests no longer upon human labor. It was, I believe, Cabet, Cabet, Voyage en Icarie, 1848, who first in a Utopian work insisted upon the escape of man from irksome labors through the use of machinery. He is the great primitive of modern Utopias, and Bellamy is his American equivalent. Hitherto, either slave labor, Phaleas, Aristotle's Politics, Book 2, Chapter 8, or at least class distinctions involving unavoidable labor in the lower class, have been assumed, as Plato does, and as Bacon in the New Atlantis probably intended to do. More gave his Utopians bondsmen sans phrase for their most disagreeable toil. Or there is, as in Morris and the outright return to nature Utopians, a bold make-believe that all toil may be made a joy, and with that a levelling down of all society to an equal participation in labor. But, indeed, this is against all the observed behavior of mankind. It needed the Olympian unworldliness of an irresponsible rich man of the shareholding type, a Ruskin or a Morris playing at life, to imagine as much. Road-making under Mr. Ruskin's auspices was a joy at Oxford, no doubt, and a distinction, and it still remains a distinction. It proved the least contagious of practices, and Hawthorne did not find bodily toil anything more than the curse the Bible says it is, at Brook Farm. The Blithedale Experiment, and see also his Notebook. If toil is a blessing, never was blessing so effectually disguised, and the very people who tell us that hesitate to suggest more than a beautiful ease in the endless day of heaven. A certain amount of bodily or mental exercise, a considerable amount of doing things under the direction of one's free imagination, is quite another matter. Artistic production, for example, when it is at its best, when a man is freely obeying himself and not troubling to please others, is really not toil at all. It is quite a different thing digging potatoes, as boys say, for a lark, and digging them because otherwise you will starve, digging them day after day as a dull, unavoidable imperative. The essence of toil is that imperative, and the fact that the attention must cramp itself to the work in hand, that it excludes freedom, and not that it involves fatigue. So long as anything but a quasi-savage life depended upon toil, so long was it hopeless to expect mankind to do anything but struggle to confer just as much of this blessing as possible upon one another. But now that the new conditions physical science is bringing about, not only dispense with man as a source of energy, but supply the hope that all routine work may be made automatic, it is becoming conceivable that presently there may be no need for any one to toil habitually at all, that a laboring class, that is to say, a class of workers without personal initiative, will become unnecessary to the world of men. The plain message physical science has for the world at large is this, that were our political and social and moral devices only as well contrived to their ends as a linotype machine, an antiseptic operating plant, or an electric tram-car, there need now at the present moment be no appreciable toil in the world, and only the smallest fraction of the pain, the fear, and the anxiety that now makes human life so doubtful in its value. There is more than enough for every one alive. Science stands, a too competent servant, behind her wrangling underbred masters, holding out resources, devices, and remedies they are too stupid to use. Footnote: see that most suggestive little book, 20th Century Inventions, by Mr. George Sutherland. And on its material side, A Modern Utopia must needs present these gifts as taken, and show a world that is really abolishing the need of labor, abolishing the last base reason for any one's servitude or inferiority. Section 7. The effectual abolition of a laboring and servile class will make itself felt in every detail of the inn that will shelter us, of the bedrooms we shall occupy. You conceive my awakening to all these things on the morning after our arrival. I shall lie for a minute or so with my nose peeping over the coverlet, agreeably and gently coming awake, and with some vague nightmare of sitting at a common table with an unavoidable dustman in green and gold called Boffin. Footnote: vide William Morris's News from Nowhere. Fading out of my mind. Then I should start up. You figure my apprehensive startled inspection of my chamber. Where am I? That classic phrase recurs. Then I perceive quite clearly that I am in bed in Utopia. Utopia! The word is enough to bring any one out of bed, to the nearest window, but thence I see no more than the great mountain mass behind the inn, a very terrestrial-looking mountain mass. I return to the contrivances about me, and make my examination as I dress, pausing garment in hand, to hover over first this thing of interest and then that. The room is, of course, very clear and clean and simple, not by any means cheaply equipped, but designed to economize the labor of redding and repair just as much as is possible. It is beautifully proportioned, and rather lower than most rooms I know on earth. There is no fireplace, and I am perplexed by that until I find a thermometer beside 6 switches on the wall. Above this switchboard is a brief instruction. One switch warms the floor, which is not carpeted, but covered by a substance like soft oilcloth. One warms the mattress, which is of metal with resistance coils threaded to and fro in it, and the others warm the wall in various degrees, each directing current through a separate system of resistances. The casement does not open, but above, flush with the ceiling, a noiseless, rapid fan pumps air out of the room. The air enters by a Tobin shaft. There is a recessed dressing-room, equipped with a bath and all that is necessary to one's toilet. And the water, one remarks, is warmed, if one desires it warm, by passing it through an electrically heated spiral of tubing. A cake of soap drops out of a store machine on the turn of a handle, and when you have done with it you drop that and your soiled towels and so forth, which also are given you by machines, into a little box through the bottom of which they drop at once and sail down a smooth shaft. A little notice tells you the price of your room, and you gather the price is doubled if you do not leave the toilette as you found it. Beside the bed, and to be lit at night by a handy switch over the pillow, is a little clock, its face flush with the wall. The room has no corners to gather dirt, wall meets floor with a gentle curve, and the apartment could be swept out effectually by a few strokes of a mechanical sweeper. The door frames and window frames are of metal, rounded and impervious to draught. You are politely requested to turn a handle at the foot of your bed before leaving the room, and forthwith the frame turns up into a vertical position, and the bedclothes hang airing. You stand at the doorway and realize that there remains not a minute's work for any one to do. Memories of the fetid disorder of many an earthly bedroom after a night's use float across your mind. And you must not imagine this dustless, spotless, sweet apartment as anything but beautiful. Its appearance is a little unfamiliar, of course, but all the muddle of dust-collecting hangings and witless ornament that cover the earthly bedroom, the valances, the curtains to check the draught from the ill-fitting wood windows, the worthless, irrelevant pictures, usually a little askew, the dusty carpets, and all the paraphernalia about the dirty, black-leaded fireplace are gone. But the faintly tinted walls are framed with just one clear-colored line, as finely placed as the member of a Greek capital. The door-handles and the lines of the panels of the door, the two chairs, the framework of the bed, the writing-table, have all that final simplicity, that exquisite finish of contour that is begotten of sustained artistic effort. The graciously shaped windows each frame a picture. Since they are draughtless, the window-seats are no mere mockeries, as are the window-seats of earth. And on the sill, the sole thing to need attention in the room, is one little bowl of blue alpine flowers. The same exquisite simplicity meets one downstairs. Our landlord sits down at table with us for a moment, and seeing we do not understand the electrically heated coffee-pot before us, shows us what to do. Coffee and milk we have, in the continental fashion, and some excellent rolls and butter. He is a swarthy little man, our landlord, and overnight we saw him preoccupied with other guests. But we have risen either late or early by Utopian standards, we know not which, and this morning he has us to himself. His bearing is kindly and inoffensive, but he cannot conceal the curiosity that possesses him. His eye meets ours with a mute inquiry, and then as we fall to, we catch him scrutinizing our cuffs, our garments, our boots, our faces, our table manners. He asks nothing at first, but says a word or so about our night's comfort and the day's weather, phrases that have an air of being customary. Then comes a silence that is interrogative. "Excellent coffee," I say to fill the gap. "And excellent rolls," says my botanist. Our landlord indicates his sense of our approval. A momentary diversion is caused by the entry of an elfin-tressed little girl, who stares at us half impudently, half shyly, with bright black eyes, hesitates at the botanist's clumsy smile and nod, and then goes and stands by her father and surveys us steadfastly. "You have come far?" ventures our landlord, patting his daughter's shoulder. I glance at the botanist. "Yes," I say, "we have." I expand. "We have come so far that this country of yours seems very strange indeed to us." "The mountains?" "Not only the mountains." "You came up out of the Ticino valley?" "No, not that way." "By the Oberalp?" "No." "The Furka?" "No." "Not up from the lake?" "No." He looks puzzled. "We came," I say, "from another world." He seems trying to understand. Then a thought strikes him, and he sends away his little girl with a needless message to her mother. "Ah," he says, "another world, eh?" "Meaning—" "Another world, far in the deeps of space." Then at the expression of his face one realizes that a modern Utopia will probably keep its more intelligent citizens for better work than intending. He is evidently inaccessible to the idea we think of putting before him. He stares at us a moment, and then remarks, "There's the book to sign." We find ourselves confronted with a book, a little after the fashion of the familiar hotel visitor's book of earth. He places this before us, and beside it puts pen and ink and a slab, upon which ink has been freshly smeared. "Thumb marks," says my scientific friend hastily in English. "You show me how to do it," I say as quickly. He signs first, and I look over his shoulder. He is displaying more readiness than I should have expected. The book is ruled in broad transverse lines, and has a space for a name, for a number, and a thumb mark. He puts his thumb upon the slab and makes the thumb mark first with the utmost deliberation. Meanwhile he studies the other two entries. The numbers of the previous guests above are complex muddles of letters and figures. He writes his name, then with a calm assurance writes down his number: A.M. A. 1607 to A.B. plus. I am wrung with momentary admiration. I follow his example, and fabricate an equally imposing signature. We think ourselves very clever. The landlord proffers finger bowls for our thumbs, and his eye goes, just a little curiously, to our entries. I decide it is advisable to pay, and go before any conversation about our formulae arises. As we emerge into the corridor, and the morning sunlight of the Utopian world, I see the landlord bending over the book. "Come on," I say. "The most tiresome thing in the world is explanations, and I perceive that if we do not get along, they will fall upon us now." I glance back to discover the landlord and a gracefully robed woman standing outside the pretty simplicity of the Utopian inn, watching us doubtfully as we recede. "Come on," I insist. Section 8. We should go towards the Schoellene gorge, and as we went, our fresh morning senses would gather together 1,000 factors for our impression of this more civilized world. A modern Utopia will have done with yapping about nationality, and so the ugly fortifications, the barracks and military defilements of the earthly vale of Urseren will be wanting. Instead, there will be a great multitude of gracious little houses clustering in college-like groups, no doubt about their common kitchens and halls, down and about the valley slopes. And there will be many more trees, and a great variety of trees. All the world will have been ransacked for winter conifers. Despite the height of the valley, there will be a double avenue along the road. This high road with its tramway would turn with us to descend the gorge, and we should hesitate upon the adventure of boarding the train. But now we should have the memory of our landlord's curious eye upon us, and we should decide at last to defer the risk of explanations such an enterprise might precipitate. We should go by the great road for a time, and note something of the difference between Utopian and terrestrial engineering. The tramway, the train road, the culverts and bridges, the Urnerloch tunnel into which the road plunges, will all be beautiful things. There is nothing in machinery, there is nothing in embankments and railways and iron bridges and engineering devices to oblige them to be ugly. Ugliness is the measure of imperfection. A thing of human making is for the most part ugly in proportion to the poverty of its constructive thought, to the failure of its producer fully to grasp the purpose of its being. Everything to which men continue to give thought and attention, which they make and remake in the same direction, and with a continuing desire to do as well as they can, grows beautiful inevitably. Things made by mankind under modern conditions are ugly, primarily because our social organization is ugly, because we live in an atmosphere of snatch and uncertainty, and do everything in an underbred, strenuous manner. This is the misfortune of machinery, and not its fault. Art, like some beautiful plant, lives on its atmosphere, and when the atmosphere is good, it will grow everywhere, and when it is bad, nowhere. If we smashed and buried every machine, every furnace, every factory in the world, and without any further change set ourselves to home industries, hand labor, spade husbandry, sheep folding, and pig minding, we should still do things in the same haste, and achieve nothing but dirtiness, inconvenience, bad air, and another gaunt and gawky reflection of our intellectual and moral disorder. We should mend nothing. But in Utopia, a man who designs a tram road will be a cultivated man, an artist craftsman. He will strive, as a good writer, or a painter strives, to achieve the simplicity of perfection. He will make his girders and rails and parts as gracious as that first engineer, Nature, has made the stems of her plants and the joints and gestures of her animals. To esteem him a sort of anti-artist, to count every man who makes things with his unaided thumbs an artist, and every man who uses machinery as a brute, is merely a passing phase of human stupidity. This tram road beside us will be a triumph of design. The idea will be so unfamiliar to us that for a time it will not occur to us that it is a system of beautiful objects at all. We shall admire its ingenious adaptation to the need of a district that is buried half the year in snow, the hard bed below curved and guttered to do its own clearing, the great arched sleeper masses raising the rails a good 2 yards above the ground, the easy, simple standards and insulators. Then it will creep in upon our minds, but, by Jove, this is designed. Indeed, the whole thing will be designed. Later on, perhaps, we may find students in an art school working in competition to design an electric tram, students who know something of modern metallurgy, and something of electrical engineering, and we shall find people as keenly critical of a signal box or an iron bridge as they are on earth of... Heavens! What are they critical about on earth? The quality and condition of a dress tie! We should make some unpatriotic comparisons with our own planet, no doubt. End of Chapter 3, Utopian Economics, Sections 5 through 8. Recording by Bill Borst.
Chapter 4 of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lina. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter the 4th. The Voice of Nature. Section 1. Presently we recognize the fellow of the earthly Devil's Bridge, still intact as a footway, spanning the gorge, and old memories turn us off the road down the steep ruin of an ancient mule track towards it. It is our first reminder that Utopia too must have a history. We cross it and find the Rus, for all that it has already lit and warmed and ventilated and cleaned several thousands of houses in the dale above, and for all that it drives those easy trams in the gallery overhead, is yet capable of as fine a cascade as ever it flung on earth. So we come to a rocky path, wild as one could wish, and descend, discoursing how good and fair an ordered world may be, but with a certain unformulated qualification in our minds about those thumb marks we have left behind. "Do you recall the Zermatt Valley?" says my friend, "and how on earth it reeks and stinks with smoke? People make that an argument for obstructing change, instead of helping it forward." And here, perforce, an episode intrudes. We are invaded by a talkative person. He overtakes us and begins talking forthwith in a fluty but not unamiable tenor. He is a great talker, this man, and a fairly respectable gesticulator, and to him it is we make our first ineffectual tentatives at explaining who indeed we are. But his flow of talk washes that all away again. He has a face of that rubicund knobby type I have heard an indignant mineralogist speak of as botryoidal, and about it waves a quantity of disorderly blonde hair. He is dressed in leather doublet and knee breeches, and he wears over these a streaming woolen cloak of faded crimson that give him a fine dramatic outline as he comes down towards us over the rocks. His feet, which are large and handsome, but bright pink with the keen morning air, are bare, except for sandals of leather. It was the only time that we saw anyone in Utopia with bare feet. He salutes us with a scroll-like waving of his stick, and falls in with our slower paces. "Climbers, I presume," he says. "And you scorn these trams of theirs? I like you. So do I. Why a man should consent to be dealt with as a bale of goods holding an indistinctive ticket, when God gave him legs and a face, passes my understanding." As he speaks, his staff indicates the great mechanical road that runs across the gorge and high overhead through a gallery in the rock, follows it along until it turns the corner, picks it up as a viaduct far below, traces it until it plunges into an arcade through a jutting crag, and there dismisses it with a spiral whirl. "No," he says. He seems sent by Providence, for just now we had been discussing how we should broach our remarkable situation to these Utopians before our money is spent. Our eyes meet, and I gather from the botanist that I am to open our case. I do my best. "You came from the other side of space," says the man in the crimson cloak, interrupting me. "Precisely. I like that. It's exactly my note. So do I. And you find this world strange. Exactly my case. We are brothers. We shall be in sympathy. I'm amazed. I have been amazed as long as I can remember, and I shall die, most certainly, in a state of incredulous amazement at this remarkable world. Eh? You found yourselves suddenly upon a mountain top. Fortunate men," he chuckled. "For my part, I found myself in the still stranger position of infant to two parents of the most intractable dispositions." "The fact remains," I protest. A position, I can assure you, demanding tact of an altogether superhuman quality. We desist for a space from the attempt to explain our remarkable selves, and for the rest of the time this picturesque and exceptional utopian takes the talk entirely under his control. Section 2. An agreeable person, though little distracting he was, and he talked, we recall, of many things. He impressed us, we found afterwards, as a poser beyond question, a conscious Ishmaelite in the world of wit, and in some subtly inexplicable way as a most consummate ass. He talked first of the excellent and commodious trams that came from over the passes, and ran down the long valley towards middle Switzerland, and of all the growth of pleasant homes and chalets amidst the heights that made the opening gorge so different from its earthly parallel, with a fine disrespect. "But they are beautiful," I protested. "They are graciously proportioned. They are placed in well-chosen positions. They give no offence to the eye." "What do we know of the beauty they replace? They are a mere rash. Why should we men play the part of bacteria upon the face of our mother? All life is like that. No, not natural life. Not the plants and the gentle creatures that live their wild, shy lives in forest and jungle. That is a part of her. That is the natural bloom of her complexion. But these houses and tramways and things, all made from ore and stuff torn from her veins. You can't better my image of the rash. It's a morbid breaking out. I'd give it all for one, what is it? Free and natural chamois." "You live at times in a house?" I asked. He ignored my question. For him, untroubled nature was the best, he said, and, with a glance at his feet, the most beautiful. He professed himself a Nazarite, and shook back his Teutonic poet's shock of hair. So he came to himself, and for the rest of our walk he kept to himself as the thread of his discourse, and went over himself from top to toe, and strung thereon all topics under the sun by way of illustrating his splendours. But especially his foil was the relative folly, the unnaturalness and want of logic in his fellow men. He held strong views about the extreme simplicity of everything, only that men, in their muddle-headedness, had confounded it all. Hence, for example, these trams. They're always running up and down as though they were looking for the lost simplicity of nature. We dropped it here. He earned a living, we gathered, some considerable way above the minimum wage, which threw a chance light on the labor problem, by perforating records for automatic musical machines, no doubt of the pianotist and pianola kind. And he spent all the leisure he could gain in going to and fro in the earth lecturing on the need of a return to nature, and on simple foods and simple ways. He did it for the love of it. It was very clear to us he had an inordinate impulse to lecture, and esteemed us fair game. He had been lecturing on these topics in Italy, and he was now going back through the mountains to lecture in Saxony, lecturing on the way, to perforate a lot more records, lecturing the while, and so start out lecturing again. He was undisguisedly glad to have us to lecture to by the way. He called our attention to his costume at an early stage. It was the embodiment of his ideal of nature clothing, and it had been made especially for him at very great cost, simply because naturalness has fled the earth, and has to be sought now, and washed out from your crushed complexities like gold. "I should have thought," said I, "that any clothing whatever was something of a slight upon the natural man." "Not at all," said he, "not at all. You forget his natural vanity." He was particularly severe on our artificial hoofs, as he called our boots, and our hats, or hair destructors. "Man is the real king of beasts, and should wear a mane. The lion only wears it by consent and in captivity." He tossed his head. Subsequently, while we lunched, and he waited for the specific natural dishes he ordered, they taxed the culinary resources of the inn to the utmost, he broached a comprehensive generalization. "The animal kingdom and the vegetable kingdom are easily distinguished, and for the life of me I see no reason for confusing them. It is, I hold, a sin against nature. I keep them distinct in my mind, and I keep them distinct in my person. No animal substance inside, no vegetable without. What could be simpler or more logical? Nothing upon me but leather and all wool garments, within, cereals, fruits, nuts, herbs, and the like. Classification, order, man's function. He is here to observe and accentuate nature's simplicity. These people," he swept an arm that tried not too personally to include us, "are filled and covered with confusion." He ate great quantities of grapes and finished with a cigarette. He demanded and drank a great horn of unfermented grape juice, and it seemed to suit him well. We three sat about the board. It was an agreeable little arbour on a hill hard by the place where Wasson stands on earth, and it looked down the valley to the Uri Rothstock, and ever and again we sought to turn his undeniable gift of exposition to the elucidation of our own difficulties. But we seemed to get little, his style was so elusive. Afterwards, indeed, we found much information and many persuasions had soaked into us, but at the time it seemed to us he told us nothing. He indicated things by dots and dashes, instead of by good hard assertive lines. He would not pause to see how little we knew. Sometimes his wit rose so high that he would lose sight of it himself, and then he would pause, purse his lips as if he whistled, and then till the bird came back to the lore, fill his void mouth with grapes. He talked of the relations of the sexes, and love, a passion he held in great contempt as being in its essence complex and disingenuous, and afterwards we found we had learnt much of what the marriage laws of Utopia allow and forbid. "A simple natural freedom," he said, waving a grape in an illustrative manner, and so we gathered the modern Utopia did not at any rate go to that. He spoke, too, of the regulation of unions, of people who were not allowed to have children, of complicated rules and interventions. Man, he said, had ceased to be a natural product. We tried to check him with questions at this most illuminating point, but he drove on like a torrent, and carried his topic out of sight. The world, he held, was overmanaged, and that was the root of all evil. He talked of the overmanagement of the world, and among other things of the laws that would not let a poor simple idiot, a natural, go at large. And so we had our first glimpse of what Utopia did with the feeble and insane. We make all these distinctions between man and man, we exalt this and favor that, and degrade and seclude that. We make birth artificial, life artificial, death artificial. "You say we," said I, with the first glimmering of a new idea, "but you don't participate?" "Not I. I'm not one of your samurai, your voluntary noblemen who have taken the world in hand. I might be, of course, but I'm not." "Samurai?" I repeated. "Voluntary noblemen?" and for the moment could not frame a question. He whirled on to an attack on science that stirred the botanist to controversy. He denounced with great bitterness all specialists whatever, and particularly doctors and engineers. "Voluntary noblemen," he said. "Voluntary gods, I fancy they think themselves," and I was left behind for a space in the perplexed examination of this parenthesis, while he and the botanist, who was sedulous to keep his digestion up to date with all the newest devices, argued about the good of medicine men. "The natural human constitution," said the blond-haired man, "is perfectly simple, with one simple condition: you must leave it to nature. But if you mix things up so distinctly and essentially separated as the animal and vegetable kingdoms, for example, and ram that in for it to digest, what can you expect? Ill health. There isn't such a thing, in the course of nature. But you shelter from nature in houses, you protect yourselves by clothes that are useful instead of being ornamental, you wash with such abstersive chemicals as soap, for example, and above all you consult doctors." He approved himself with a chuckle. "Have you ever found anyone seriously ill without doctors and medicine about? Never! You say a lot of people would die without shelter and medical attendance. No doubt, but a natural death is better than an artificial life, surely. That's, to be frank with you, the very citadel of my position." That led him, and rather promptly, before the botanist could rally to reply, to a great tirade against the laws that forbade "sleeping out." He denounced them with great vigour, and alleged that for his own part he broke the law whenever he could, found some corner of moss, shaded from an excess of dew, and there sat up to sleep. He slept, he said, always in a sitting position, with his head on his wrists and his wrists on his knees, the simple natural position for sleep in man. He said it would be far better if all the world slept out, and all the houses were pulled down. You will understand, perhaps, the subdued irritation I felt, as I sat and listened to the botanist entangling himself in the logical net of this wild nonsense. It impressed me as being irrelevant. When one comes to a Utopia, one expects a cicerone. One expects a person as precise and insistent and instructive as an American advertisement. The advertisement of one of those land agents, for example, who print their own engaging photographs to instill confidence and begin, "You want to buy real estate." One expects to find all Utopians absolutely convinced of the perfection of their Utopia, and incapable of receiving a hint against its order. And here was this purveyor of absurdities. And yet now that I come to think it over, Is not this, too, one of the necessary differences between a modern utopia and those finite compact settlements of the older school of dreamers? It is not to be a unanimous world any more. It is to have all and more of the mental contrariety we find in the world of the real. It is no longer to be perfectly explicable. It is just our own vast mysterious welter, with some of the blackest shadows gone, with a clearer illumination, and a more conscious and intelligent will. Irrelevance is not irrelevant to such a scheme, and our blonde-haired friend is exactly just where he ought to be here. Still. Section 3. I ceased to listen to the argumentation of my botanist with this apostle of nature. The botanist, in his scientific way, was, I believe, defending the learned professions. He thinks and argues like drawing on squared paper. It struck me as transiently remarkable that a man who could not be induced to forget himself and his personal troubles on coming into a whole new world, who could waste our first evening in Utopia upon a paltry egotistical love story, should presently become quite heated and impersonal in the discussion of scientific professionalism. He was absorbed. I can't attempt to explain these vivid spots and blind spots in the imaginations of sane men. There they are. "You say," said the botanist, with a prevalent index finger, and the resolute deliberation of a big siege gun being lugged into action over rough ground by a number of inexperienced men, "you prefer a natural death to an artificial life. But what is your definition of artificial?" And after lunch, too. I ceased to listen, flicked the end of my cigarette ash over the green trellis of the arbor, stretched my legs with a fine restfulness, leant back, and gave my mind to the fields and houses that lay adown the valley. What I saw interwove with fragmentary things our garrulous friend had said, and with the trend of my own speculations. The high road, with its tramways and its avenues on either side, ran in a bold curve, and with one great loop of descent down the opposite side of the valley, and below crossed again on a beautiful viaduct, and dipped into an arcade in the side of the Bristenstock. Our inn stood out boldly, high above the level this took. The houses clustered in their collegiate groups over by the high road, and near the subordinate way that ran almost vertically below us and past us and up towards the valley of the Mayan Rus. There were one or two Utopians cutting and packing the flowery mountain grass in the carefully levelled and irrigated meadows by means of swift, light machines that ran on things like feet and seemed to devour the herbage. And there were many children and a woman or so, going to and fro among the houses near at hand. I guessed a central building towards the high road must be the school from which these children were coming. I noted the health and cleanliness of these young heirs of Utopia as they passed below. The pervading quality of the whole scene was a sane order, the deliberate solution of problems, a progressive intention steadily achieving itself, and the aspect that particularly occupied me was the incongruity of this with our blonde-haired friend. On the one hand, here was a state of affairs that implied a power of will, an organizing and controlling force, the cooperation of a great number of vigorous people to establish and sustain its progress, and on the other this creature of pose and vanity, with his restless wit, his perpetual giggle at his own cleverness, his manifest incapacity for comprehensive cooperation. Now, had I come upon a hopeless incompatibility? Was this the reductio ad absurdum of my vision, and must it even as I sat there fade, dissolve, and vanish before my eyes? There was no denying our blonde friend. If this Utopia is indeed to parallel our earth, man for man, and I see no other reasonable choice to that, there must be this sort of person and kindred sorts of persons in great abundance. The desire and gift to see life whole is not the lot of the great majority of men. The service of truth is the privilege of the elect, and these clever fools who choke the avenues of the world of thought, who stick at no inconsistency, who oppose, obstruct, confuse, will find only the freer scope amidst utopian freedoms. They argued on, these two, as I worried my brains with riddles. It was like a fight between a cock-sparrow and a tortoise. They both went on in their own way, regardless of each other's proceedings. The encounter had an air of being extremely lively, and the moments of contact were few. "But you mistake my point," the blond man was saying, disordering his hair, which had become unruffled in the preoccupation of dispute, with a hasty movement of his hand. "You don't appreciate the position I take up." "Ugh," said I privately, and lighted another cigarette and went away into my own thoughts with that. The position he takes up, that's the way of your intellectual fool the universe over. He takes up a position, and he's going to be the most brilliant, delightful, engaging, and invincible of gay, delicious creatures defending that position you can possibly imagine. And even when the case is not so bad as that, there still remains the quality. We take up our positions, silly little contentious creatures that we are. We will not see the right in one another. We will not patiently state and restate, and honestly accommodate and plan, and so we remain at 6s and 7s. We've all got a touch of Gladstone in us, and try to the last moment to deny we have made a turn. And so our poor, broken-springed world jolts athwart its trackless destiny. Try to win into line with some fellow weakling, and see the little host of suspicions, aggressions, misrepresentations your approach will stir, like summer flies on a high road, the way he will try to score a point and claim you as a convert to what he has always said, his fear lest the point should be scored to you. It is not only such gross and palpable cases as our blonde and tenoring friend. I could find the thing negligible were it only that. But when one sees the same thread woven into men who are leaders, men who sway vast multitudes, who are indeed great and powerful men, when one sees how unfair they can be, how unteachable, the great blind areas in their eyes also, their want of generosity, then one's doubts gather like mists across this utopian valley, its vistas pale, its people become unsubstantial phantoms, all its order and its happiness dim and recede. If we are to have any utopia at all, we must have a clear common purpose, and a great and steadfast movement of will to override all these incurably egotistical dissentients. Something is needed wide and deep enough to float the worst of egotisms away. The world is not to be made right by acclamation and in a day, and then forevermore trusted to run alone. It is manifest this utopia could not come about by chance and anarchy, but by coordinated effort and a community of design, and to tell of just land laws and wise government, a wisely balanced economic system, and wise social arrangements without telling how it was brought about, and how it is sustained against the vanity and self-indulgence, the moody fluctuations and uncertain imaginations, the heat and aptitude for partisanship that lurk, even when they do not flourish, in the texture of every man alive, is to build a palace without either door or staircase. I had not this in mind when I began. Somewhere in the modern utopia there must be adequate men, men the very antithesis of our friend, capable of self-devotion, of intentional courage, of honest thought and steady endeavor. There must be a literature to embody their common idea, of which this modern utopia is merely the material form. There must be some organization, however slight, to keep them in touch one with the other. Who will these men be? Will they be a caste, a race, an organization in the nature of a church? And there came into my mind the words of our acquaintance, that he was not one of these voluntary noblemen. At first that phrase struck me as being merely queer, and then I began to realize certain possibilities that were wrapped up in it. The animus of our chance friend, at any rate, went to suggest that here was his antithesis. Evidently what he is not will be the class to contain what is needed here. Evidently. Section 4. I was recalled from my meditations by the hand of the blond-haired man upon my arm. I looked up to discover the botanist had gone into the inn. The blond-haired man was for a moment almost stripped of pose. "I say," he said, "weren't you listening to me?" "No," I said bluntly. His surprise was manifest, but by an effort he recalled what he had meant to say. "Your friend," he said, "has been telling me, in spite of my sustained interruptions, a most incredible story." I wondered how the botanist managed to get it in. "About that woman," I said. "About a man and a woman who hate each other and can't get away from each other." "I know," I said. "It sounds absurd." "It is." "Why can't they get away? What is there to keep them together? It's ridiculous. Quite. He would tell it to me." "It's his way." "He interrupted me, and there's no point in it. Is he—" he hesitated. "Mad?" "There's a whole world of people mad with him," I answered, after a pause. The perplexed expression of the blond-haired man intensified. It is vain to deny that he enlarged the scope of his inquiry, visibly if not verbally. "Dear me," he said, and took up something he had nearly forgotten. "And you found yourselves suddenly on a mountainside? I thought you were joking." I turned round upon him with a sudden access of earnestness. At least I meant my manner to be earnest, but to him it may have seemed wild. "You," I said, "are an original sort of man. Do not be alarmed. Perhaps you will understand. We were not joking." "But, my dear fellow—" "I mean it. We come from an inferior world, like this, but out of order. No world could be more out of order. You play at that and have your fun, but there's no limit to the extent to which a world of men may get out of gear. In our world—" He nodded, but his eye had ceased to be friendly. "Men die of starvation. People die by the 100,000 needlessly and painfully. Men and women are lashed together to make hell for each other. Children are born, abominably, and reared in cruelty and folly. There is a thing called war, a horror of blood and vileness. The whole thing seems to me at times a cruel and wasteful wilderness of muddle. You in this decent world have no means of understanding." "No?" he said, and would have begun, but I went on too quickly. "No! When I see you dandering through this excellent and hopeful world, objecting, obstructing, and breaking the law, displaying your wit on science and order, on the men who toil so ingloriously to swell and use the knowledge that is salvation, this salvation for which our poor world cries to heaven—" "You don't mean to say," he said, "that you really come from some other world where things are different and worse?" "I do." "And you want to talk to me about it instead of listening to me?" "Yes." "Oh, nonsense," he said abruptly. "You can't do it, really. I can assure you this present world touches the nadir of imbecility. You and your friend with his love for the lady who's so mysteriously tied, you're romancing. People could not possibly do such things. It's, if you'll excuse me, ridiculous. He would begin, a most tiresome story, simply bore me down. We'd been talking very agreeably before that, or rather I had, about the absurdity of marriage laws, the interference with a free and natural life, and so on, and suddenly he burst like a dam. No!" He paused. "It's really impossible. You behave perfectly well for a time, and then you begin to interrupt, and such a childish story, too." He spun round upon his chair, got up, glanced at me over his shoulder, and walked out of the arbour. He stepped aside hastily to avoid too close an approach to the returning botanist. "Impossible," I heard him say. He was evidently deeply aggrieved by us. I saw him presently a little way off in the garden, talking to the landlord of our inn, and looking towards us as he talked. They both looked towards us. And after that, without the ceremony of a farewell, he disappeared, and we saw him no more. We waited for him a little while, and then I expounded the situation to the botanist. "We are going to have a very considerable amount of trouble explaining ourselves," I said in conclusion. "We are here by an act of the imagination, and that is just one of those metaphysical operations that are so difficult to make credible. We are, by the standard of bearing and clothing I remark about us, unattractive in dress and deportment. We have nothing to produce to explain our presence here, no bit of a flying machine or a space-travelling sphere or any of the apparatus customary on these occasions. We have no means beyond a dwindling amount of small change out of a gold coin, upon which I suppose in ethics and the law some native utopian had a better claim. We may already have got ourselves into trouble with the authorities with that confounded number of yours. You did one too. All the more bother, perhaps, when the thing is brought home to us. There's no need for recriminations. The thing of moment is that we find ourselves in the position, not to put too fine a point upon it, of tramps in this admirable world. The question of all others of importance to us at present is what do they do with their tramps? Because sooner or later, and the balance of probability seems to incline to sooner, whatever they do with their tramps, that they will do with us. Unless we can get some work. Exactly. Unless we can get some work. Get work. The botanist leant forward on his arms and looked out of the arbour with an expression of despondent discovery. "I say," he remarked, "this is a strange world. Quite strange and new. I'm only beginning to realize just what it means for us. The mountains there are the same, the old Bristol stock and all of the rest of it, but these houses, you know, and that roadway, and the costumes, and that machine that is licking up the grass there, only—" He sought expression. "Who knows what will come in sight round the bend of the valley there? Who knows what may happen to us anywhere? We don't know who rules over us even. We don't know that." "No," I echoed. "We don't know that." End of Chapter 4. Recording by Elena, Cocoa, Florida.
Chapter the 5th of A Modern Utopia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christopher Taylor. A Modern Utopia by H.G. Wells. Chapter the 5th. Failure in a Modern Utopia. Section 1. The old utopias, save for the breeding schemes of Plato and Campanella, ignored that reproductive competition among individualities which is the substance of life, and dealt essentially with its incidentals, the endless variety of men, their endless gradation of quality over which the hand of selection plays, and to which we owe the unimaginable complication of real life, is tacitly set aside. The real world is a vast disorder of accidents and incalculable forces in which men survive or fail. A modern utopia, unlike its predecessors, dare not pretend to change the last condition. It may order and humanize the conflict, but men must still survive or fail. Most utopias present themselves as going concerns, as happiness in being. They make it an essential condition that a happy land can have no history, and all the citizens one is permitted to see are well-looking and upright and mentally and morally in tune. But we are under the dominion of a logic that obliges us to take over the actual population of the world with only such moral and mental and physical improvements as lie within their inherent possibilities. And it is our business to ask what Utopia will do with its congenital invalids, its idiots and madmen, its drunkards and men of vicious mind, its cruel and furtive souls, its stupid people, too stupid to be of use to the community, its lumpish, unteachable, and unimaginative people. What will it do with the man who is poor all round, the rather spiritless, rather incompetent low-grade man who on earth sits in the den of the sweater, tramps the streets under the banner of the unemployed, or trembles in another man's cast-off clothing, and with an infinity of hat-touching, on the verge of rural employment? These people will have to be in the descendant phase. The species must be engaged in eliminating them. There is no escape from that. And conversely, the people of exceptional quality must be ascendant. The better sort of people, so far as they can be distinguished, must have the fullest freedom of public service, and the fullest opportunity of parentage, and it must be open to every man to approve himself worthy of ascendancy. The way of nature in this process is to kill the weaker and the sillier, to crush them, to starve them, to overwhelm them, using the stronger and more cunning as her weapon. But man is the unnatural animal, the rebel child of nature, and more does he turn himself against the harsh and fitful hand that reared him. He sees with a growing resentment the multitude of suffering ineffectual lives over which his species tramples in its ascent. In the modern utopia he will have set himself to change the ancient law. No longer will it be that failures must suffer and perish lest their breed increase, but the breed of failure must not increase lest they suffer and perish, and the race with them. Now we need not argue here to prove that the resources of the world and the energy of mankind, were they organized sanely, are amply sufficient to supply every material need of every living human being. And if it can be so contrived that every human being shall live in a state of reasonable physical and mental comfort without the reproduction of inferior types, there is no reason whatever why that should not be secured. But there must be a competition in life of some sort to determine who are to be pushed to the edge, and who are to prevail and multiply. Whatever we do, man will remain a competitive creature, and though moral and intellectual training may vary and enlarge his conception of success and fortify him with refinements and consolations, no utopia will ever save him completely from the emotional drama of struggle, from exaltations and humiliations, from pride and prostration and shame. He lives in success and failure just as inevitably as he lives in space and time. But we may do much to make the margin of failure endurable. On earth, for all the extravagance of charity, the struggle for the mass of men at the bottom resolves itself into a struggle, and often a very foul and ugly struggle, for food, shelter, and clothing. Deaths outright from exposure and starvation are now perhaps uncommon, but for the multitude there are only miserable houses, uncomfortable clothes, and bad and insufficient food, fractional starvation and exposure, that is to say. A utopia planned upon modern lines will certainly have put an end to that. It will insist upon every citizen being properly housed, well nourished, and in good health, reasonably clean and clothed healthfully, and upon that insistence its labour laws will be founded. In a phrasing that will be familiar to everyone interested in social reform, it will maintain a standard of life. Any house, unless it be a public monument, that does not come up to its rising standard of healthiness and convenience, the utopian state will incontinently pull down and pile the material and charge the owner for the labour. Any house unduly crowded or dirty, it must in some effectual manner, directly or indirectly, confiscate and clear and clean. And any citizen indecently dressed, or ragged and dirty, or publicly unhealthy, or sleeping abroad homeless, or in any way neglected or derelict, must come under its care. It will find him work if he can and will work. It will take him to it. It will register him and lend him the money wherewith to lead a comely life until work can be found or made for him, and it will give him credit and shelter him, and strengthen him if he is ill. In default of private enterprises, it will provide inns for him and food, and it will, by itself acting as the reserve employer, maintain a minimum wage which will cover the cost of a decent life. The state will stand at the back of the economic struggle as the reserve employer of labour. This most excellent idea does, as a matter of fact, underlie the British institution of the workhouse, but is jumbled up with the relief of old age and infirmity. It is administered parochially, and on the supposition that all population is static and localized, whereas every year it becomes more migratory. It is administered without any regard to the rising standards of comfort and self-respect in a progressive civilization, and it is administered grudgingly. The thing that is done as unwilling charity by administrators who are often, in the rural districts at least, competing for low-priced labour, and who regard want of employment as a crime. But if it were possible for any citizen in need of money to resort to a place of public employment as a right, and there work for a week or month without degradation upon certain minimum terms, it seems fairly certain that no one would work, except as the victim of some quite exceptional and temporary accident, for less. The work publicly provided would have to be toilsome, but not cruel or incapacitating. A choice of occupations would need to be afforded, occupations adapted to different types of training and capacity, with some residual employment of a purely laborious and mechanical sort for those who were incapable of doing things that required intelligence. Necessarily, this employment by the state would be a relief of economic pressure, but it would not be considered a charity done to the individual, but a public service. It need not pay any more than the police need pay, but it could probably be done at a small margin of loss. There is a number of durable things bound finally to be useful that could be made and stored whenever the tide of more highly paid employment ebbed and labour sank to its minimum. Bricks, iron from inferior ores, shaped and preserved timber, pens, nails, plain fabrics of cotton and linen, paper, sheet glass, artificial fuel, and so on. New roads could be made and public buildings reconstructed, inconveniences of all sorts removed, until under the stimulus of accumulating material, accumulating investments or other circumstances, the tide of private enterprise flowed again. The state would provide these things for its citizen, as though it was his right to require them. He would receive as a shareholder in the common enterprise and not with any insult of charity. But on the other hand, it will require that the citizen who renders the minimum of service for these concessions shall not become a parent until he is established in a work at a rate above the minimum, and free of any debt he may have incurred. The state will never press for its debt, nor put a limit to its accumulation so long as a man or woman remains childless. It will not even grudge them temporary spells of good fortune when they may lift their earnings above the minimum wage. It will pension the age of everyone who cares to take a pension, and it will maintain special guest homes for the very old to which they may come as paying guests, spending their pensions there. By such obvious devices, it will achieve the maximum elimination of its feeble and spiritless folk in every generation, with the minimum of suffering and public disorder. Section 2. But the mildly incompetent, the spiritless and dull, the poorer sort who are ill, do not exhaust our utopian problem. There remain idiots and lunatics. There remain perverse and incompetent persons. There are people of weak character who become drunkards, drug takers and the like. Then there are persons tainted with certain foul and transmissible diseases. All these people spoil the world for others. They may become parents, and with the most of them there is manifestly nothing to be done but to seclude them from the great body of the population. You must resort to a kind of social surgery. You cannot have social freedom in your public ways. Your children cannot speak with whom they will. Your girls and gentlewomen cannot go abroad while some sorts of people go free. And there are violent people, and those people who will not respect the property of others, thieves and cheats. They too, so soon as their nature is confirmed, must pass out of the free life of the ordered world. So soon as there can be no doubt of the disease or baseness of the individual, so soon as the insanity or other disease is assured, or the crime repeated a third time, or the drunkenness or misdemeanor past its seventh occasion, let us say, so soon must he or she pass out of the common ways of men. The dreadfulness of all such proposals as this lies in the possibility of their execution falling into the hands of hard, dull, and cruel administrators. But in the case of a utopia, one assumes the best possible government, a government as merciful and deliberate as it is powerful and decisive. You must not too hastily imagine these things being done as they would be done on earth at present by a number of zealous, half-educated people in a state of panic at a quite imaginary rapid multiplication of the unfit. No doubt for first offenders, and for all offenders under 25, the modern utopia will attempt cautionary and remedial treatment. There will be disciplinary schools and colleges for the young, fair and happy places, but with less confidence and more restraint than the schools and colleges of the ordinary world. In remote and solitary regions, these enclosures will lie. They will be fenced in and forbidden to the common run of men, and there, remote from all temptation, the defective citizen will be schooled. There will be no masking of the lesson. Which do you value most? The wide world of humanity, or this evil trend in you? From that discipline, at last, the prisoner will return. But the others, what would a saner world do with them? Our world is still vindictive, but the all-reaching state of utopia will have the strength that begets mercy. Quietly the outcast will go from among his fellow men. There will be no drumming of him out of the ranks, no tearing off of epaulettes, no smiting in the face. The thing must be just public enough to obviate secret tyrannies, and that is all. There would be no killing, no lethal chambers. No doubt Utopia will kill all deformed and monstrous and evilly diseased births. But for the rest, the state will hold itself accountable for their being. There is no justice in nature, perhaps, but the idea of justice must be sacred in any good society. Lives that statesmanship has permitted, errors it has not foreseen and educated against, must not be punished by death. If the state does not keep faith, no one will keep faith. Crime and bad lives are the measure of a state's failure. All crime in the end is the crime of the community. Even for murder, Utopia will not, I think, kill. I doubt even if there will be jails. No men are quite wise enough, good enough, and cheap enough to staff jails as a jail ought to be staffed. Perhaps islands will be chosen, islands lying apart from the highways of the sea, and to these the state will send its exiles, most of them thinking heaven, no doubt, to be quit of a world of prigs. The state will, of course, secure itself against any children from these people. That is the primary object in their seclusion, and perhaps it may even be necessary to make these island prisons a system of island monasteries and island nunneries. Upon that I am not competent to speak. But if I may believe the literature of the subject, unhappily a not very well criticized literature, it is not necessary to enforce this separation. Footnote. See, for example, Dr. W. A. Chappell's The Fertility of the Unfit. About such islands patrol boats will go. There will be no freedoms of boat building, and it may be necessary to have armed guards at the creeks and quays. Beyond that, the state will give these segregated failures just as full a liberty as they can have. If it interferes any further, it will be simply to police the islands against the organization of serious cruelty, to maintain the freedom of any of the detained who wish it to transfer themselves to other islands, and so to keep a check upon tyranny. The insane, of course, will demand care and control, but there is no reason why the islands of the hopeless drunkard, for example, should not each have a virtual autonomy, have at the most a resident and a guard. I believe that a community of drunkards might be capable of organizing even its own bad habit to the pitch of tolerable existence. I do not see why such an island should not build and order for itself, and manufacture and trade. Your ways are not our ways, the world state will say. But here is freedom, and a company of kindred souls. Elect your jolly rulers, brew if you will, and distill. Here are vine cuttings and barley fields. Do as it pleases you to do. We will take care of the knives, but for the rest, deal yourselves with God. And you see the big convict steamships standing into the island of incurable cheats. The crew are respectfully at their quarters, ready to lend a hand overboard, but wide awake, and the captain is hospitably on the bridge to bid his guests good-bye and to keep an eye on the movables. The new citizens for this particular Alsatia, each no doubt with his personal belongings securely packed and in hand, crowd the deck and study the nearing coast. Bright, keen faces would be there, and we, were we by any chance to find ourselves beside the captain, might recognise the double of this great earthly magnate or that, Petticoat Lane and Park Lane cheek by jowl. The landing part of the jetty is clear of people. Only a government man or so stands there to receive the boat and prevent a rush, but beside the gates a number of engagingly smart-looking individuals loiter speculatively. One figures a remarkable building labelled Custom House, an interesting fiscal revival this population has made, and beyond, crowding up the hill, the painted walls of a number of comfortable inns clamour loudly. One or two inhabitants in reduced circumstances would act as hotel touts. There are several hotel omnibuses and a bureau de change, certainly a bureau de change. And a small house with a large board, aimed point-blank seaward, declares itself a gratis information office, and next to it rises the graceful dome of a small casino. Beyond, great hoardings proclaim the advantages of many island specialties, a hustling commerce, and the opening of a public lottery. There is a large, cheap-looking barrack, the School of Commercial Science for gentlemen of inadequate training. Altogether a very go-ahead-looking little port it would be, and though this disembarkation would have none of the flow of hilarious good fellowship that would throw a halo of genial noise about the islands of drink, it is doubtful if the new arrivals would feel anything very tragic in the moment. Here at last was scope for adventure after their hearts. This sounds more fantastic than it is, but what else is there to do unless you kill? You must seclude, but why should you torment? All modern prisons are places of torture by restraint, and the habitual criminal plays the part of a damaged mouse at the mercy of the cat of our law. He has his little painful run, and back he comes again to a state more horrible even than destitution. There are no Alsatias left in the world. For my own part I can think of no crime, unless it is the reckless begetting or wilful transmission of contagious disease, for which the bleak terrors, the solitudes, the ignominies of the modern prison do not seem outrageously cruel. If you want to go as far as that, then kill. Why, once you are rid of them, should you pester criminals to respect an uncongenial standard of conduct? Into such islands of exile as this, a modern utopia will have to purge itself. There is no alternative that I can contrive. Section 3. Will a utopian be free to be idle? Work has to be done. Every day humanity is sustained by its collective effort, and without a constant recurrence of effort in the single man as in the race as a whole, there is neither health nor happiness. The permanent idleness of a human being is not only burthensome to the world, but his own secure misery. But unprofitable occupation is also intended by idleness, and it may be considered whether that freedom also will be open to the utopian. Conceivably it will, like privacy, locomotion, and almost all the freedoms of life, and on the same terms, if he possess the money to pay for it. That last condition may produce a shock in minds accustomed to the proposition that money is the root of all evil, and to the idea that utopia necessarily implies something rather oaken and handmade and primitive in all these relations. Of course, money is not the root of any evil in the world. The root of all evil in the world, and the root of all good too, is the will to live, and money becomes harmful only when, by bad laws and bad economic organization, it is more easily attained by bad men than good. It is as reasonable to say food is the root of all disease, because so many people suffer from excessive and unwise eating. The sane economic ideal is to make the possession of money the clear indication of public serviceableness, and the more nearly that ideal is attained, the smaller is the justification of poverty, and the less the hardship of being poor. In barbaric and disorderly countries, it is almost honourable to be indigent, and unquestionably virtuous to give to a beggar. And even in the more or less civilized societies of earth, so many children come into this life hopelessly handicapped, that austerity to the poor is regarded as the meanest of mean virtues. But in Utopia, everyone will have had an education and a certain minimum of nutrition and training. Everyone will be insured against ill health and accidents. There will be the most efficient organization for balancing the pressure of employment and the presence of disengaged labor, and so to be moneyless will be clear evidence of unworthiness. In Utopia, no one will dream of giving to a casual beggar, and no one will dream of begging. There will need to be, in the place of the British casual wards, simple but comfortable inns with a low tariff, controlled to a certain extent no doubt, and even in some cases maintained by the state. This tariff will have such a definite relation to the minimum permissible wage that a man who has incurred no liabilities through marriage or the like relationship will be able to live in comfort and decency upon that minimum wage, pay his small insurance premium against disease, death, disablement, or ripening years, and have a margin for clothing and other personal expenses, but he will get neither shelter nor food except at the price of his freedom, unless he can produce money. But suppose a man without money in a district where employment is not to be found for him, suppose the amount of employment to have diminished in the district with such suddenness as to stranded him there, or suppose he has quarrelled with the only possible employer, or that he does not like this particular work. Then no doubt the Utopian state, which wants everyone to be just as happy as the future welfare of the race permits, will come to his assistance. One imagines him resorting to a neat and business-like post office, and stating his case to a civil and intelligent official. In any sane state, the economic conditions of every quarter of the earth will be watched as constantly as its meteorological phases, and a daily map of the country within a radius of 300 or 400 miles, showing all the places where labor is needed, will hang upon the post office wall. To this his attention will be directed. The man out of work will decide to try his luck in this place or that, and the public servant, the official, will make a note of his name, verify his identity. The freedom of Utopia will not be incompatible with the universal registration of thumb marks, and issue passes for travel and coupons for any necessary inn accommodation on his way to the chosen destination. There he will seek a new employer. Such a free change of locality once or twice a year from a region of restricted employment to a region of labor shortage will be among the general privileges of the Utopian citizen. But suppose that in no district in the world is there work within the capacity of this particular man. Before we suppose that, we must take into consideration the general assumption one is permitted to make in all Utopian speculations. All Utopians will be reasonably well educated upon Utopian lines. There will be no illiterates unless they are unteachable imbeciles, no rule of thumb toilers as inadaptable as trained beasts. The Utopian worker will be as versatile as any well-educated man is on earth today, and no trade union will impose a limit to his activities. The world will be his union. If the work he does best and likes best is not to be found, there is still work he likes second best. Lacking his proper employment, he will turn to some kindred trade. But even with that adaptability, it may be that sometimes he will not find work. Such a disproportion between the work to be done and the people to do it may arise as to present a surplus of labor everywhere. This disproportion may be due to two causes: to an increase of population without a corresponding increase of enterprises, or to a diminution of employment throughout the world due to the completion of great enterprises, to economies achieved, or to the operation of new and more efficient labor-saving appliances. Through either cause, a world state may find itself doing well, except for an excess of citizens of mediocre and lower quality. But the first cause may be anticipated by wise marriage laws. The full discussion of these laws will come later, but here one may insist that Utopia will control the increase of its population. Without the determination and ability to limit that increase as well as to stimulate it whenever it is necessary, no Utopia is possible. That was clearly demonstrated by Malthus for all time. The second cause is not so easily anticipated, but then, though its immediate result in glutting the labour market is similar, its final consequences are entirely different from those of the first. The whole trend of a scientific mechanical civilization is continually to replace labour by machinery and to increase it in its effectiveness by organization, and so quite independently of any increase in population,